Good evening, everybody. It's just gone 6:30, and we will make a start. Apologies for the slight delay. And before we go any further, Happy New Year, everybody. Okay, before we go any further, just remind members, they may have forgotten over the holidays, I suspect not, but in particular advise members of the public who are speaking this evening, please do make sure that you've got the microphone on, with a little red light on, and speak clearly into it so everybody can hear what is being said. We are webcasting the meeting this evening, and the webcasting works in relation to the speakers, I understand. By taking part in this evening's meeting, you are agreeing to being filmed live and potentially subsequently broadcast as well by the council's internet, via the internet site. Anybody has any questions, particularly in the public gallery, about this, please speak to one of the stewards. Can I ask the committee clerk, please, to read out the public announcement?
Apologies, I'm just waiting for all the document to open. Sorry, I don't have it to hand. There's no planned fire alarm this evening, but if one does come on, please leave by the nearest exit and congregate in the Queen's Gardens, and we will take a foster there. If anyone needs to take a phone call, please make sure that you leave the room so that you don't disturb the meeting. Apologies.
Okay, shall we introduce ourselves? Yep. Okay, Councillor Paul Scott, Chair of the Planning Committee. If we could run around this way for officers and members, please.
Good evening. Yes, again, apologies for me being slightly late. My name is Pete Smith. I'm the Head of Development Management at Croydon. Thank you.
Good evening. Councillor Humayun Kabir, Vice Chair of the Committee.
Jason Perry, Councillor for Crome Ward.
Chris Wright, Coulson East.
Councillor Patsy Cummings, South Norwood, standing in for Bernadette Khan.
Councillor Joy Prince, Warden Ward.
Nicola Townsend, North Team Leader, Development Management.
Katie Marks, Planning Officer, Development Management.
Good evening, Ross Gentry, South Area Team Leader in Development Management.
Is it me? Councillor Shafiq Khan, I'm covering for Councillor Sharon Chaudhry.
Councillor Sue Winborn, Fairfield Ward.
Victoria Lower, Clerk to the committee.
My name is Sean Murphy, I'm the Legal Advisor to the committee.
Thank you very much, everybody. First item on the agenda this evening, 6.1, minutes of the meetings held firstly on the 7th of December. Are those agreed? Councillor Wright?
Well, slight correction. I was absent, Mr Chairman, and my apologies were not recorded.
Okay, we can make sure that is amended. But otherwise, other than that, are those agreed?
Agreed, yeah.
Great, thank you. And then the meeting of the 18th of December, those agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. We have apologies already been announced for Councillor Bernadette Khan. Also, we have apologies for Councillor Audsley, who hasn't been able to find a reserve tonight, so we are down to 9 members on the committee. Councillor Perry?
Just to advise that Councillor Clancy is stuck on a train, so we'll be a little bit late.
Okay. Many of us understand that predicament all too well, I'm sure. Okay, thank you, everybody. Disclosures of interest. Are there any disclosures of interest for the items before us this evening? No. We have no items of urgent business. Before we move on to the development presentation, I should just note that item 6.3, this is 6.3, let's just double check that. Item 6.3, 40 Brighton Road, has been withdrawn from the agenda and will be decided by the officers. instead of being decided before the committee. So, stepping back, item 5.1, development presentations. We have the Queen's Hotel, and we have who do we have here? We have Mr. Quelch, Ms. Cairns, Mr. Pitt and Mr. Rust, understand, who are the applicants and applicants' agents. I see 3 people, not 4, but I'm sure you'll make that clear to us in a moment. You've got up to 15 minutes to tell us about your revised proposals. Thank you. Before we just move on to that, if Mr. Smith just wants to say a few quick words about the context for the presentation this evening.
Thank you, Chair. Members will recall back in October 2017, a scheme for the refurbishment and extension of the Queen's Hotel was considered by this committee, and after a lot of debate and discussion, this committee was minded to refuse planning permission for 2 reasons: issues around overdevelopment linked to the failure to preserve or enhance the character appearance of the Church Road conservation area, and issues around car parking, or parking generally, was the issue, and we've related that in a reason for refusal around the intensity of use and how that affects on-street car parking and on-street sort of management of parking generally. It was a resolution to refuse. That actually went to the London Mayor because it was a stage 2 referral, because it was a mayoral referral application. The Mayor came back to us and said, I'm not going to, I'm happy for Croydon to make its own decision on this. So that's what did, and as I say, the application and decision notice to refuse was issued on the 29th of November. The applicant, to be fair to them, have wanted to come back and talk to us further about addressing those points, and we've had a number of meetings with the applicant since the decision by this committee back in October. As members can see, this is a bit of a new type of pre-application report. We try to make these reports more punchier, less onerous around policy, and actually get into the nub of the issues that we would like, or we think that the committee should focus its attention. So, referring quickly to the summary, clearly the main focus here is to how the applicant is addressing the reasons for refusal. And we've identified 6 or 7 bullets in section 5.1 of the report. And it's really looking at issues of height and mass and bulk, and how that, particularly at the back of the development, the spine, the east-west spine, members will remember that clearly, and how that is viewed from the Fitzroy Gardens garden and generally within the character and appearance of the conservation area, and how the changes have balanced the considerations around potential regeneration benefits of the hotel and an enhanced hotel and a refurbished hotel against any harm that is identified as part of the character appearance conservation area. There was a discussion last time around elevational changes and how the architect has approached the elevations of the building, so that's something that we've been talking to the applicants about, and it'd be interesting to hear how members feel about that. Clearly, reduction in intensity of use and height and mass reduces the number of bedrooms, so there are proposals to reduce the number of bedrooms, and you'll hear that from the applicant, and again, it would be interesting to hear members' views around that, but it's really then linked to how it changes and affects the height and mass of the building. Looking at on-site car parking, the proposals are to increase the amount of on-site car parking, so you'll hear about that, and it'd be interesting to hear what members feel about that. But also, there was debate, if members will recall last time, about charging for car parking on-site and how that might work or might not work, and there was discussion around that, around people's ability and capacity to park on street or within the basement car park. There's some discussions around overnight coach parking last time, and there's been discussions around that, as well as capacity for coach parking on the site. And finally, issues around privacy, particularly the end unit at 18 Fitzroy Gardens, which is the end unit in the cul-de-sac part of Fitzroy Gardens, and how the application deals with that. So we think that's the main focus of this discussion, but clearly if a new application comes in, that application will have to be considered afresh. But also a consideration would be the previous reason for refusal and how that scheme addresses those issues. So I just wanted to if you like, set the scene, if I may, Chair, just before, so that people can be suitably focused around the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Okay. We're good to go? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can clarify. I'm Richard Quelch, the planning consultant from GVA. I've got Katie Cairns from ASAIL, who's the architect, that will talk primarily about the first reason for refusal, which related to the design of the scheme in terms of the context of the conservation area. And we've got Phil Rust from Steer Davies Cleave, who will talk about the car parking reason for refusal. So I think Pete's probably covered off some of the things that I was going to say about what's happened since October Planning Committee and our discussions with officers. What I suppose I'd probably like to say is our clients would still like to continue to develop the site in a comprehensive manner and deliver a number of the benefits that we discussed at the last Planning Committee. So in particular, looking at improved hotel accommodation, bringing the existing accommodation up to a better standard. And they've been in discussions with Best Western as a brand hotel. So there's already an agreement with them for Best Western to take the scheme forward. Also delivering improved facilities within the hotel that don't currently exist. So a swimming pool and a spa. The improvements, the visual improvements to the building, there's obviously the new extensions which we'll talk about, but also cladding the 1970s block at the front. The landscaping as well around the building is also another key benefit that should hopefully improve the visual appearance of the building. So, as Pete mentioned, there were two reasons for refusal, which the first one was the relationship with the conservation area and the scale of massing, and the second was the car parking. And just to refresh you on the scheme that went to Planning Committee in October, that's the front of the scheme. So you've got the original building in the centre, and then to the right you've got what was, or what is currently, the 1970s building, which we're proposing to reclad. And then looking at the refuse scheme from the opposite end of Church Road, there is the scheme's bookended. So you've got a new block on the opposite end, fronting onto Church Road. And then this was the view from the communal garden on Fitzroy Gardens, which shows what we call the rear spine of the scheme, which runs from Church Road to the back of the site. So just in summary, the scheme that you previously saw had 530 hotel rooms, heights from 2 to 6 stories, 170 car parking spaces, which is a ratio of 0.32 spaces per room, and it had 3 coach parking spaces. So I'll pass over to Katie now from ASAIL, who will talk about the first reason refusal and how we've looked to address it.
Good evening. Just wanted to start off by, I thought it would be helpful to reiterate some of the design principles of the original design strategy, especially those in relation to seeking to minimise the impact on neighbours and the conservation area. And just to reiterate the fact that our underlying objective has always been to respect and enhance the conservation area, bringing about benefits wherever possible, as Richard just said. So this first design principle is just showing how we're replacing unsightly and poor quality existing buildings to the rear with a new build rear spine, which we've looked at the massing for, which I'll come to a bit later. Another one is being sensitive to neighbouring properties and pulling massing away from neighbours which are close by wherever possible. Another design principle has been to retain all of the existing trees on the site. These not only help to enhance the conservation area, but also provide privacy for neighbouring properties. In addition to retaining the existing buildings, we're also proposing additional landscape buffer zones around the proposed buildings, which on the next slide you can see a section through showing how the landscaping would relate to the neighbouring Regency Gardens, which is a communal residence garden used a lot by the neighbouring properties, and just showing there how a landscape buffer would provide additional privacy. And then our final design principle, which we're just reiterating we'll still be doing, is retaining what is called the Muse building at the rear. Part of that will be retained, as was the scheme previously, because this has come following extensive consultation with local residents who feel that that provides, again, a buffer and provides some privacy for local residents who are close by to the hotel. So following the committee last October, we've been looking at some changes to the scheme, listening to what the committee members had to say, but also the opinions of local residents, and we've also been in discussions with planning officers. I'll just show you some of the options that we looked at previously in our design development. So we felt that the most sensitive part of the site is at the rear in this sort of new build spine, because that's closest to where the neighbouring properties are, and it's also, as you can see, where the land slopes down, so there's a sort of lower stories at the rear of the hotel compared to those at the front at Church Road. So we've been looking at removing massing at the back there. This first option looked at just removing one story from the block closest to the Fitzroy Gardens spur, and that brought the overall room count down from 530 to 513. And these were just some preliminary views showing what that would look like. Another option we looked at was removing 2 stories from that same block at the back there. That brought the room count even further down to 506 rooms. And these are the views from a couple of the neighbouring streets and the Regency Gardens. However, our preferred solution, the one that we've ended up going forward with, is by removing 1 story from the block closest to the Fitzroy Gardens and then 1 story from that central block as well, because we feel that this improves the impact on the conservation area the most. From a townscape perspective, we feel that it enhances it and it respects the scale and massing of the surrounding area. And those are the views of that. So this just shows a comparison with the Refusal scheme, which is the elevation at the top, and then what we have updated it to look like, which is the elevation at the bottom. You can see, as Pete mentioned, that as well as the scale and massing, we've also been looking at the elevational treatment and how we can improve the design, trying to break up the massing slightly more. And being more sensitive to neighbouring properties. This one, again, the Refusal scheme is the elevation at the top, and the current proposals is the elevation at the bottom. We've incorporated in recesses and added more variation to the facade at the back to try and provide a bit more interest, articulation, and really break down the overall mass to make it feel a lot more smaller.
I'll just point out one thing. You can see where this is where I've got the red dot. This was obviously the Refusal scheme, and this block is closest to the properties on Fitzroy Gardens. And you can see what we've looked at is by taking this story off here, the maximum height of the building is broadly in line with the ridge height of the properties on Fitzroy Gardens. So that's one particular relationship that we've been looking at.
We've also been looking at a few other design development in terms of the architecture. So previously, you can see here from this diagram, the spine building at the back was just a sort of straight line in its massing, whereas now what we've done in plan is to actually articulate that facade by adding in recesses to create variety and interest and to break down that overall massing. So that's a sort of architectural technique to improve that. In terms of privacy with neighbouring properties, that's something we've been looking at a lot, and you can see from these diagrams that there's about a 45-metre distance between any sort of habitable room to the hotel. There is a little bit of So there's no direct overlooking, so to speak. You can see at the rear there is number 18 Fitzroy Gardens, which is the closest property which we're sort of closest to, and there's some potential for overlooking at an angle there onto the rear garden. But by bringing in these recesses, some of those windows are actually pulled a lot further away, and we've been looking at that and discussing that with officers and feel that we've been addressing any matters regarding privacy. Something else we've been doing is articulating the elevation a lot more by bringing in textured brickwork and sort of different materials such as metal and the buff brick previously. We've been working with officers to develop that further. We've also looked at the colour of the bronze anodised aluminium and gone with something slightly darker than we were previously proposing, again to provide more variety and depth to the facade. So this is a visualisation image of the Refuse scheme from the front, and then that is how it is updated. So the metal has got slightly darker, but you can also see there that we have increased the amount of greening and landscaping at the front there to really provide more of a viewpoint for the historic hotel and to enhance the conservation area further. And then a view at the rear. This is a new view that we've produced. This is looking from Regency Gardens back at the Refuse scheme, and then with the changes to the massing, so reducing the massing, that's what it's looking like now. And we've also developed that elevation further. I'll now pass over to Phil.
Good evening. So, do you want to take the first slide? So just a sort of summary of parking numbers, and this comes down to a little bit of mathematics in effect. The current hotel has 63 spaces, which works out at 0.19 space for each room. So for every 5 rooms, there's 1 parking space. And the previous scheme was obviously quite a significant increase in the car parking spaces, up to 107, and almost a 50% additional parking space for each bedroom in the future. Putting that in context, the anticipated sort of car driver, so this is the number of cars one would expect on average at a hotel, is lower than that at 0.27 use per bedroom, and the reason for that is that quite a few people would be anticipated in London to come by public transport, and obviously it's a London hotel, and that makes a difference to the ratios that you might anticipate elsewhere. But those figures were agreed, and we looked at them in depth, and they were agreed both by your officers and also by Transport for London officers who separately reviewed the figures. It's also worth saying the hotel's well located for bus services and very practical walking distance into Crystal Palace, which obviously has the links into central London, quite relevant to the use of the anticipated use of the hotel, both and its existing use. And the previous understanding reached with officers was that the parking ratio was sufficient for anticipated demand. But clearly, as members, you provided your own view on that, and we've taken that on board. So just having a look at the revised arrangements, what we've now got is more parking spaces and less bedrooms. So the equivalent parking ratio, so this is space per room, has now increased to 0.42, and that's 50% further increase in parking ratio. And another way of looking at that, perhaps, is that, as I said earlier, at the moment, for every 5 bedrooms, there's roughly 1 parking space. In the future, those additional spaces, we're providing 4 additional parking spaces for every 5 bedrooms. So it's 4 times as many for the additional bedrooms, and the overall ratio then goes up to 0.42, which is twice as many as currently available. So there's 2 parking spaces for every 5 bedrooms, or slightly more than that, as compared with 1 for every 5 bedrooms at the moment. So obviously that you can see that leaves us with a figure that's, again, even higher than the anticipated average use of hotels in London. And I think we'll obviously get support from officers and from TfL that will continue to provide the sufficient spaces that should avoid overspill parking, which is the concern that you'd have as members and local residents would be worried about, quite understandably. So
just stop you 1 moment. Sorry. Your 15 minutes are pretty much up. If you've got a few more just closing comments.
Indeed. Yeah. So we jump onto the. Yeah, and the other point is that we're able to manage those spaces. So the intention would be that all spaces are advertised, and that when people book a hotel space, a hotel room, they'd automatically be taken through to the car park booking service at the same time. So, and encouraging people to realise that if they are going to bring their car, that there's parking spaces. The only very quick other point is on coach arrivals, coach points, and with the revised layout, we've identified the opportunity for 5 coach spaces to be provided at the front of the hotel. They're shown as a group there. So this is mainly intended for overnight parking, if necessary. Coaches don't have to stay on the hotel site, but there are many that would, because they are associated with a group that are likely possibly to be based at the hotel. So that's the intention, to provide up to 5 spaces. In practice, that space can be quite flexibly used, so that gives it use for other things as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Did you have one more?
I think the point that we wanted to make as well is, compared to what's already consented on site, there is on the southern block there's a consent already. We're effectively looking at a net increase of 134 rooms compared if that scheme was built out. And I think I suppose what I'm trying to say is we're trying to deliver a range of benefits, we believe, for the 134 rooms. So we think that's, in a way, a good return in terms of the delivery of that. And the other sort of key point we wanted to make as well is about the 0.88 parking spaces for the extra room, because I think that helps to demonstrate that actually for the extra rooms there is quite a high parking provision.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Right, well, that brings us on to questions and comments from the committee. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through the 5 or 6 bullet point items that the officers have raised in the report first, and ask members to comment on those particular points, and then we'll go to any further points that anybody wishes to raise, if that's okay with everybody. So the first one is the extent to which the reductions in height, mass and bulk of the proposed east-west spine element reduce the harm caused to the character and appearance of the conservation area, etc., etc. So we want to start off with that one. Any views, opinions? And I think particularly, obviously, a number of people who were on the committee supported the previous application, a number didn't. And I think particularly it would be useful to hear from those that didn't support it previously, whether this would overcome their concerns. Councillor Wright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And remembering the application that we had way back in October, I think what is proposed at the moment, it does a great deal to helping the people in Fitzroy Gardens, because that's what their problem was, I think, before, that they were concerned about the mass and the overlooking point of view. So I would think that what we've got proposed now, it would go a long way towards that, and I would support that as being a good positive proposal.
It does strike me as quite a significant reduction in the massing, particularly as it steps down to where the existing housing is, isn't it? Does anybody else wish to comment on that particular point? Councillor Cummings?
Thank you, Chair. There has been a lot of work, I think, that's been done to address some of the issues that have been raised in the previous scheme. You said you had a lot of consultation with council officers. Did you have any ongoing consultation with the residents? Obviously, there were a lot of residents that had concern because of the overdevelopment, and obviously this scheme with reduction in height, and with the one of the properties that you say that was of greatest concern. Have you actually continued that dialogue, and have you had any feedback from them as to whether or not the new proposed scheme is something that they are in dialogue with you about?
Yeah, I mean, we've the Fitzroy and Wakefield Gardens residents group. We have been in contact with them, and we were keen to meet them before we actually presented to planning committee. But what we've been in discussions with them is that they would prefer to have a wider consultation. So that will be held on the 22nd and 23rd of January. So those letters for that consultation have gone out. We obviously haven't had that public consultation, but we're keen to engage with them.
Okay, thank you. Well, no further comments on that particular one. The extent to which the elevational changes, specifically the south-facing elevation to the east-west spine extension, and the east-facing facade to the southern extension of the original hotel provides added enhancement and interest to the architectural rhythm of the proposed extensions. They're not snappy bullet points, unfortunately, but hey. Councillor Prince.
Yes, I've just got one question, really, and one comment. I do like the improvements, the more articulated facade to the side of what I'm calling the side of the hotel. It looks a lot less sort of in your face and blockish. You mentioned, though, some a wider range of materials, including specifically darker brick and aluminium things. Is that just to the spine of the hotel, or will any of that be reflected on the Church Road frontage, which, of course, is a much more sort of cream colour?
So in the original scheme that we presented back in October, we always had two main materials in our palette. There was a sort of light buff brick and then a sort of anodized bronze aluminium to act as a sort of secondary material. So we've kept that on both the Church Road elevation and at the rear. The only thing that we've done is actually change the sort of the colour of that bronze, because we felt that it was a bit washed out in comparison to the yellow original historic building, and we wanted to provide a bit more of a contrast with the historic building to give it more prominence. So what we've done is just slightly darken that. So if you go to the next slide, you can just see the difference between the sort of darkness. Oh, that's the Refusal scheme, and then that's the updated scheme. So there's not actually that much difference in the materials. It's just a very slightly darker anodized aluminium.
And would that be on both wings? Would that be on the recladded 70s part as well as this new bit here?
Yes, that's correct. Both wings on either side of the historic buildings are aimed to be a similar style, whether it's a new build on one side or the reclad on the other. And the idea there is to sort of have these quite sort of minimal and contemporary bookends to quite an elaborate and intricate historic building in the centre. We've tried to sort of keep the architectural detailing quite sort of high quality and robust, but not too intricate to not compete with historic buildings.
Yes, I'd like to a few comments on this myself, actually. Councillor Khan, do you want to go first? No, go on, you go first. Sorry, I did see.
Thank you very much. I think it is the right point to make. Like the interest of the architectural rhythm, although I don't understand fully what does it mean, I assume aesthetical view. For me, I haven't seen it before, but for me, from the drawing, the left-hand side building looks like a very ordinary one. I would like to see something a bit, it stands out. When you come to curtains is changing a lot. in a positive way, and we would like to portray that it is more interesting in terms of architecture, in terms of viewing things. Probably, can we do anything else, to improve, or you think that you have exhausted all the possible things? That's what I wanted to know. It's not a very critical point, but I'm just sharing something.
Yeah, we have been through quite...
Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, we have, over the process of getting to this point, been through quite a number of different options and things, and actually through discussions with design officers at Croydon, sort of discounted more elaborate and intricate designs. We feel that what we have done, though, is actually add in this brick texture. So that's a sort of slightly patterned brickwork, which is something a little bit more unique and provides interest and variety. That's just showing some precedence. So sort of certain elements, panels are set back, and they've got sort of almost like a hit and miss brickwork detail, which we think adds excitement and interest to the facade and makes it more special.
I would say, in terms of particularly if we could go back to the front elevation or front perspective, I think if you look at this facade and an understanding how it's sort of evolved over the years, if you take the central block, what was the original hotel, it has always remained, with the exception of the not particularly sympathetic 1970s extension, as the biggest piece of a compilation of pieces that make up that Church Road facade. And by remaining the biggest piece, it has remained the most prominent and the most, the emphasis is on that. If we look further down the sort of road, sort of going north, you see there how the building is actually quite heavily sort of broken up into taller, sometimes narrower sections. We get to the proposed extension to the south side. The width of the sort of the creamy coloured, I presume it's cream coloured, lighter element, the lower element, is much wider. And you also then try to break it up, I think possibly recognising that, with these sort of slightly recessed sort of bays with different colour materials in, and then you've got your hit and miss brickwork. To me, that's the wrong kind of approach, because you're almost saying we want something that's a very simple and plain piece of architecture, so the existing architecture stands out, and then it's looking a bit too plain, so we'll stick some different materials on and some different textures to actually add more interest back in. And I think you need to be bolder one way or the other in the way you're actually detailing this. And it might well be that you add more interest in, say, the window surrounds or the coping details, or some kind of sort of horizontal banding, or something that is actually part of the architecture, not something that is added on as a texture or a simple change in material. So that actually the overall effect is that that central block still is the most dominant, but then you've then got a simpler language but a slightly more sophisticated level of detailing on that southern block. And I think the same applies through onto the garden facade as well, where you're breaking up the facade with these recessed panels. And I think I really do strongly think that's a really weak way of doing it. The stronger way of doing it is take your recessed bays, make those in the different, probably darker material, and then just go where the elements are simpler, just accept they are simpler. Don't try and add on these other sort of finishes and colours and patterns and textures. Go for a simple facade, because that's what the original architecture would have done. Do you follow me? I mean, I think that would really help in terms of creating an understanding of the architecture here, and a more sympathetic, if slightly bolder, sort of reference back to the original buildings.
On the materials, something we had looked at was whether we introduced another brick colour, say like a slightly darker brick, to provide a bit more interest and variety. But in the end, sort of following discussions, decided that to keep with the sort of just the two main materials, so that we weren't becoming too fussy or anything like that. And I think that, again, from discussions with officers, wanted brick to be the predominant material with the metal as a sort of secondary one and not be too over-dominant. But, you know, we can definitely take on board some of your comments and go back and have a look. You know, this is not like it's the final scheme and we're wanting to take on board people's opinions. So, yeah, thank you very much for those.
So I think simple. I mean, look at the original building and its extensions are all pretty much in the same materials and the same sort of architectural detailing or whatever. They don't actually just try and sort of, other than with the 1970s extension, try and do something too dramatic. And I think that would be a more sympathetic way of actually dealing with those facades. So please do take that on board. Any further comments on this particular issue? No. Then the next snappy bullet point, is whether the reduction in the overall number of hotel bedrooms proposed, a reduction of 35 rooms compared to the previously refused scheme, successfully reduces the intensity of the use, the scale of development proposed towards the rear of the site, and the overall on-site parking ratio.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to make particularly a comment about the car park, the ratio. I'm pleased to see that it has been listened to, and I think this will help local residents to calm them down a little bit as well, because there were lots of discussion about car park in the last scheme. So I support that. And again, regarding the number and the reduction, I think now it's fitting as a Bible development. I think it's a reasonable size now, and I think I'm going to support this. Yeah.
Coming briefly, Chair, I just think it's important to remind the committee that, I mean, I'm sure this is in people's minds, but we're obviously not deciding this application this evening, and what is sought from members are views on the proposals as they're emerging. It's important that members don't predetermine anything this evening, because that would disbar them from taking part in the future debate when this matter comes to committee to be decided. So it's just to remind members of that point.
Yeah, so I'll stop there, saying that with the changes that Chair proposed with the added bit, if it's sort of maintained uniformity in that sense, I think that will be a good move. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any comments?
Thank you, Chair. One of the issues for the previous scheme was the overdevelopment, and I think we were moving from a 334-bedroom hotel to 530, the original scheme, and I think this one is 35 less, is it, to 495. I think the 334 was considered quite a lot in the first place. So whilst the reduction, I think, is really good, that all of these issues have been considered, and reducing the number of bedrooms and expanding the car parking facilities, it's still quite a lot of bedrooms for the site, for the area, for the roads, for the traffic. And I know you said that there's a lot of work that's been done with the officers in the TfL. So I'm just going to be really interested to hear the outcome of some of the further discussions you're going to be having in the short to medium term with regard to the residents, in terms of how that impacts on the reduction of rooms, and whether or not that's still reduced enough to be not considered overdevelopment. And in terms of the car park, I know that's the next point, but in terms of the car park, I think there was talk about the whether or not the car park would be, the residents would be paying for it, or the hotel guests would be paying for it. And it's a double-edged sword, really, because you could have patrons of the hotel who will park on the street or the nearby roads because they don't want to pay for their stay, which will then impact on the residents. So, again, it's good to have enough spaces for the patrons of the hotel. If it was free parking, I would say that most of the patrons would park on the hotel. But if it's paid for and they're staying for a couple of nights, perhaps they would actually park on the roads, and that would have an impact on the residents. Just something to be considered. But that, I guess, again, will come out of further discussions you're going to have prior to the application.
Chair, if I could, respond. So helpful comments from Councillor Cummings around this pay to park. And we've had a lot of discussions with the applicant about this, and I can, I guess just through personal experience, when you go for a weekend away and you're driving somewhere you're not familiar with necessarily, it's always quite comforting that that you know that right, you might be paying £5-8 a day or whatever to park in the hotel car park, but you've got the comfort that when you're going somewhere you're not familiar with, that you know that you will be during your stay, and if you book that car parking space as part of your stay, you know what to expect when you get there, rather than driving around Crystal Palace trying to find a parking space that there might not be any anyway, and then by the time you've got that, you're not. So I think the approach, and I think a lot of hotels, particularly outside or in areas like Croydon, are now looking much more at paying to park, because it's also better security for the visitors as well. So I think that's the way forward in this particular case, and we've been talking positively with the applicant about that's the way as officers we think that should. Although I do appreciate your point that people might not want to pay, but then they've got the challenge of where are they going to park, and we know there's not a huge amount of spare capacity in the area, so therefore you're risking the fact that you might not be able to park as part of your stay, which will be problematic for those visitors.
We've sort of moved into, some of these do sort of overlap a bit, whether the increase in the number of on-site car parking spaces successfully addresses the lack of available on-site car parking for hotel visitors and potential effect on the development on the availability and capacity for on-street car parking. Does anybody have anything further to say on that particular issue? I mean, I would just say quickly, I think one of the issues here is, it's a bit like trying to gauge, the reduced level of activity on the site. If you've got 35 less rooms, what does that mean? How do you actually gauge whether that's actually quite a lot less activity or not, or hardly noticeable? I suspect it's probably hardly noticeable from that perspective. I mean, the actual change in volume will be very significantly noticeable. So some of these things are quite difficult to really anticipate. But anyway, just generally then, on that point about the on-site car park, we've had some comments already. Are there any further views on that? And in particular, it's an interesting point about this point about whether charging for the parking, but you book it in advance when you book your room, will actually encourage people off the road or discourage them from paying for a parking space. I mean, do we know at this stage what the level of likely cost would be for booking a parking space within the hotel, and how that would relate to the cost of a room? I mean, if you're spending £95 on a room, say, and you're spending £3 on a parking space, that wouldn't be very much more. If you're paying £25 for the parking space, that's quite a big uplift. Do we have any indication on that at this stage?
So I have to just take advice on how much the rooms may cost. Answering the second point first, the way we've gauged it so far is by looking at comparables in the area, and a lot of the other hotels in and around the area are charging that. So we've looked into that and see what the going rate is in effect. And because that seems to be, as your officer pointed out, that reflects the way the market and people anticipate things working. So the parking charges is something of the region of £5 to £8 has been identified as the range that's out there at the moment in this part of London. You go into central London, it's obviously a lot higher, as you can imagine. So that's one point. The other point, I just want to make sure it's clearly understood, it's not just the reduction in the number of the bedrooms that's changed the parking ratio compared with the Refusal scheme. There are considerably more spaces being offered at this stage. So the ratio of parking is going up much more than just because of the reduction in the number of bedrooms in the revised scheme.
I think, just to complete the question, we're looking at around a cost of about £5 per space per night, and the average cost of a room here will probably be around £65 a night. So that sort of gives you an idea. And I think the other thing that we've been talking about as well is how potential customers are made aware of the parking within the scheme, and how the fact that they shouldn't be parking on street is advertised on the website. So what would be proposed is, I suppose, a warning to some degree that there is no potential to park on street on the website, and as an add-on, you then have the potential to add the £5 extra a night. So it would be quite clear to anyone booking a room that they should be buying it or purchasing the parking space, purchasing or hiring, renting, using the parking space for the evening.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Prince? Oh. Turn your microphone off, thank you. And the other one over there.
Sorry.
It does. We're not just being funny about it. It actually reduces the volume for every other extra one you have on, above one. So.
Yeah, I think I heard you say, but I'd like to test that I've understood properly, that you've done calculations of what proportion of your visitors are likely to come by car, by coach, by public transport, etc. And that, I think I heard you say, that based on that, you would have enough parking spaces for all, reasonably anticipated number of car-borne visitors. Is that right? Because I think that's an important point. Not the ratio of parking spaces per room for the extra rooms, but what it's going to be when it's all built, and will it be sufficient? I think that's a more relevant concept, really, for the residents. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry if there was quite a few numbers being thrown around at the time. I quite appreciate that. But the reason the database that we use is surveys of lots of car parking, lots of hotels and other land uses, but hotels in this case, and that gives you. They survey the people at the front door to understand how they've got there. So it's a multimodal trip database, which and it's established across this country, but it's particularly well populated with information in London for hotels and the alike. So, and from that, the figures are around about 0.3 spaces are required on average for an outer London hotel. So that was why, and that information was put forward at the original application, and officers were relatively content, I think, and supported the scheme because that was slightly higher than, slightly below the provision that was being offered at that stage. We're now providing quite considerably more than that in terms of a ratio, so it gives us sort of a buffer, in effect, of an extra third additional spaces. So the ratio that we're now offering is 0.4 compared with an anticipated typical requirement of 0.3. So that gives you that comfort, I think, which is the point you were raising, that all anticipated uses could reasonably be expected to stay within that number. There's obviously, as you will be very aware, there's a lot of pressure on having maximum parking standards across London and elsewhere at the moment. So there is a balance to be always met on those things.
Yes, I think if we don't get this right, then the Mayor would say no anyway in terms of the level of parking. So it's a fine balance to take. And I think, if I recall correctly, TfL were objecting to the number of parking spaces previously proposed. Yes, that's correct. So it's an interesting tightrope to walk here. Okay, Councillor Prince, did you want to come back further?
No, I was just going to ask the officers, actually, if we do this, which is going to make the residents happy, what will the Mayor's reaction likely to be? So,
yes, I think it's important that, clearly the applicant is going to be working closely with TfL to make sure they understand the context of this, and we'll be working alongside and having detailed dialogue with TfL, to manage expectations and to understand the local issues that we've got in and around Crystal Palace.
Okay, we move on to the next item, The extent to which further information on available overnight coach parking satisfies members that the local area will not be materially affected by overnight coach parking. And there was a mention in the presentation of potentially five parking bays on site in the front forecourt. I don't think you mentioned anything further about other parking provision. Apologies if I missed it if you did. I think in the previous time when this came to committee for decision, there was talk, I think, 9 overall coach parking spaces, and some of them are going to be off-site. Do you have anything further to add on that? Presumably the anticipated number hasn't dropped, but I think there was possibly some misunderstanding about what was actually proposed in terms of where the other ones would park.
So on site, we previously indicated 3 parking spaces, and that's gone up to 5. So we've identified there's some additional space, and that basically is to do with reorganising the front of the hotel. So that's 2 extra spaces, obviously on site. Off site, the potential for off site provision remains, and that was dependent on use of coach parking spaces that are available to anybody on a pre-booked basis, and that hasn't changed. So the balance remains, but the total, in effect, could be greater than it was previously, obviously.
I think it would be helpful if and when this application comes before us again to have a very, very clear sort of statement for members in terms of and wider public as well, of course. It's exactly how that would work, because many of us aren't familiar with how hotels deal with coach parking. So I think it would be very useful for us to be able to understand that, where those potential sites are, and presumably based on what you said already, you can't tell us exactly which ones you'd use on when, because they're on a booked basis, but making sure that we understand how that would work and that there is the capacity sort of within those provisions to cover what's being proposed here. Members also might want to think on how they feel about 5 coaches parked out the front as opposed to 3, and I think we'd want to be convinced that was going to work. Councillor Wright.
Thank you. I agree with you. I think when the application does come through, we want to know a bit more details on that. And I think it'd be interesting to hear what the residents say in your correspondence or your interviews with them, to see whether they, in fact, because that was one of their biggest concerns, I think, was the coach parking and where the extra coaches would park, particularly in the busy season in midsummer. And that's, I think, 5 to my way is probably a way forward, but I think we want to know, as you say, more details and more understanding of how the parking and how the drop-off position is, because if 8 or 9 coach parks are arriving at one time, where do they go and how do they get in and out, etc., and the congestion that will cause on Church Road. So I think all those things need to be ironed out and probably brought to the committee in more detail.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Khan and Councillor Cumming.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Wright actually touched on the issue. I was interested to know how the going in and coming out will be managed. I think you should address it very thoroughly, because Church Road is quite a busy road, and just opposite the site there are few parking bays, but if we put 1 coach there, probably it will take up 2 or even a bit more than 2 spaces. It will create problem, because very often, I haven't been inside the hotel for some years, but I've been there before, and it's really a problem. The gate is very narrow to go in, coming out. I'm sure you will probably aware and you will address that issue. I'm not sure how you're going to do it. Probably you can tell us a little bit more when you put the application, proper application. And what else? I forgot another point. I'll come back if I remember. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I want to say another thing. Sorry. The public transport accessibility level you mentioned probably is high, but from the hotel to the overground or Crystal Palace station, going down is easy, but coming up is it's a very, very really hilly area. Whether you go through the Foxhill or then you take left Tudor Road, and it's really, especially in a rainy day. I'm not talking about a snowy day. Rainy day is very, very difficult. So I would be a bit worried to see that all these coaches coming, if you don't have enough space inside, off-site parking, it will create probably some havoc for the residents.
Quickly gives some comfort. There'll be a separate in and out entrance at the moment, and they are enhanced, widened compared with the existing. So that's the proposals. And we will demonstrate, and the designs have been put forward that ensure that each of those coaches can get in and out of each of those spaces when all the others are parked, if that makes sense, so that they're not dependent on moving coaches around. So we believe and will be able to demonstrate, hopefully, that has been considered. I think the other point is local residents probably understand the way the hotel at the moment operates, and it has got quite a high coach use because it's targeting a certain market. And I think that the investment in the hotel will change that a little bit. So, and I think that hopefully will change the feel of the area in terms of the amount of use from coaches, and that's likely to come down, I think, compared with. There's a current high usage of sort of student-type accommodation, I think, and that isn't really with the target in the future.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Cummings?
Sorry, I don't want to go over the same sort of points, but my concern, again, is about the coach parking as well, and the coming from the station and through that one-way system as well. Silly question about the size of coaches, because obviously if you've got the maximum size coaches trying to pull in and out, that is going to actually cause traffic problems. So is there going to be a range of size of coaches? Because obviously they can range from 12-seater to 50-something seater.
Well, the designs that we're are as if they're all maximum size coaches, so that everything is designed to accommodate the worst conditions. If there's smaller coaches, then obviously that gives potential for even more to be crammed in, I suppose. But the idea is that it comfortably accommodates 5 large coaches.
Okay, thank you. And then the last of the points on the list here, whether the removal of the previously proposed angled windows in the vicinity of 18 Fitzroy Gardens reduces the degree of privacy enjoyed by those living immediately adjacent to the site. Whether there needs to be obscure glazing to any of the offending windows, potentially offending windows. I'm going to kick off with this one. I have to say I didn't like the splayed windows very much. It seemed a rather weak sort of response. And given that the relationship of the offending windows, I think that was the officially used term, is back sort of behind the back building line of the houses, I think there would be minimal overlooking there anyway into the gardens. I mean, clearly looking into the side of the house, it's not such an issue because I think it's actually a solid wall. If it isn't a solid wall, it only has very small windows in it. And then obviously looking to the front, down the road, the residential road, again, I would suggest it doesn't particularly matter. I think it would be a shame to excessively use obscured glazing as well. Though that does seem to be somewhat inappropriate. If we're going to put windows in, let's have proper windows. Personally, I don't think the impact would be unreasonably negative, particularly given that obviously being a sort of typical suburban, stroke almost urban garden, there's already quite a lot of overlooking from one garden to the other anyway. And actually, people spend less time in hotel rooms looking out of their windows anyway than they would if it was a house. So I think that personally, I don't feel that it's a negative taking away those displays. Anybody else have a view? Excuse the sort of pun. No. Okay. Everybody's sort of fairly sort of neutral on that. Does anybody have anything further? I'll finish my list. Anything further they wish to add or to raise or ask? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for coming back in a positive, well, hopefully positive, frame of mind, given the decision previously. It is good to see applicants engaging in this way, and I think that's to be very much commended. It would have been very easy just to go straight off to appeal, and I think to be looking at the application again with some fairly significant changes, I think it's fair to say, I think is to be welcomed in itself. I think there was a definite sort of positive response in terms of the reduction in the massing to the rear, and that's going to make a significant difference to the impact on the neighbours. I think we're sort of pleased to hear about the parking provision as well, and the greater capacity and clarity coming forward in terms of the coach parking as well. I think that's very positive. I think, you know, a clear understanding, or we've already got clear understanding, but I think certainly within the application as well, in terms of how the paid-for parking will work and how that's targeted at reducing the amount of on-street parking, as opposed to putting people off, I think is that's something that's come across as being very important as well. I think that picks up key sort of points. Yes, everybody happy with that as the feedback? Oh, and the design points. Yeah, we also talked about the sort of issue about, you know, actually more simplicity could actually add to the sort of quality here, and actually, you know, making sure that the buildings don't they fit in more comfortably with the original architecture.
And Chair, I think we should also recall the fact that the applicant is going to be speaking with the local residents, and I think it's important that a future submission comments on the outcome of that as part of the submission. So I think we need to recognise that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point. Okay, thank you very much. That moves us on then to the applications for decision. And we're going to take these in the following order: 6.1, 6.5, 6.4 and 6.2. So item 6.1, obviously the first of those, which is Thanet House, Coombe Road, and the presenting officer, his name is not on here, is Katie. Katie, when you're ready, please.
Okay, this is site at Thanet House, Coombe Road. The application is for alterations to roof, erection of dormer, extensions in the rear roof slopes, and installation of roof lights to the front roof slopes, and use of the fourth floor and the roof space as 7 one-bedroom flats, provision of associated refuse and cycle storage. Sorry. Closer. Sorry. Is that better? Thank you. Oops. Okay, so this site, this slide shows the site. It's outlined in red on this plan, and also outlined in red on an aerial photo. The site is on a corner plot. It's on the corner of the High Street and Coombe Road, at the crossroads with South End and Lower Coombe Street. It's located in the Croydon Metropolitan Centre and the Opportunity area, and the surrounding character is commercial along the High Street. And then on the opposite corner you have an office to residential development and partial redevelopment site. And to the rear, there are some residential properties. The existing site is residential with commercial at ground floor, and I believe there are about 30 flats in the building at present. This is a photo showing the front elevation, so standing at the corner on the junction. This part of the elevation faces towards the High Street, and then it turns the corner up Coombe Road. These photos show the rear of the site. So in the top two, you're standing on the edge of the site on Planet, on the side road, looking into the site, and on the bottom two, you're looking back towards the rear of the high street part of the building. This just shows the office to residential conversion opposite the site. It's a 5-storey building, modern design. And this slide shows other residential developments along Coombe Road. It shows examples of other roof extensions and accommodation at roof level. So this slide shows the proposed alterations to the high street elevation. It would be restricted to 3 new gable ends that you can see here, and some roof lights in between. It would also include the removal of chimneys from the roof. The new gable ends would be red clay tiles, and there'll be timber details with render panels. So this slide shows the elevation turning the corner onto Coombe Road. This elevation here is the same gable end that you saw on the previous slide, so that's the one that's actually on the corner of the plot. So the changes to this street would be mostly just roof lights. And this slide shows the rear of the site. As you can see, there will be several dormer extensions. The dormers are set down from the roof ridge, and they've been amended since the application was submitted to divide them into several smaller dormers, and the materials are now clay tiles to reflect the colour and material of the original roofs. This slide just shows the site layout, proposed site layout, so it just gives you a clear understanding of the changes of the roofscape. So the 3 gable ends that are changing from hip to gables are here. And then these dotted lines show the dormer extensions at the back. The proposed flats would all be a mixture of 1 bed, 1 person, and 1 bed, 2 person flats. And they'd all meet space standards. There wouldn't be any changes to the actual site layout apart from an increase to the bin store, which is currently located here, and introduction of 7 cycles storage spaces to the rear here. These are existing parking spaces. The new flats wouldn't have any car parking associated with them. The application is recommended for approval subject to conditions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions or clarification? Councillor Perry?
Thank you very much, Chairman. All the dormers are on the back of this scheme, which looks into Thanet Place. Yet all the pictures we've been shown are of the main roads and the sort of the large blocks. Are there no views of Thanet Place where the actual impact is going to be? Because that's terraced residential housing, 2-storey, and yet we've not been shown that. And I would have thought that's the area that's most affected by this.
Do we have any images that show looking towards the back?
Yeah. So these photos at the rear, if you can see them, this is one of the residential buildings at the back, and then this is the side elevation of the other one, and the distances. So if I just take you to, the site plan. So the side elevation that you just saw a minute ago was the side elevation of this block here. The distance between the rear windows on this property and these windows is roughly about 18 metres, and the distance from these properties, which you also saw in the photos, is about 30 metres.
I mean, yes, that's what we've seen before. I think it's inappropriate that we haven't seen photographs of Thanet Place, which is a small cul-de-sac, a small cul-de-sac leading to a dozen or so properties, and we've not been properly shown that aspect of this scheme, which I think is wrong.
I mean, to be fair, we can see the side of one house and then the sort of back elevations there as well.
But for a member of committee that doesn't know this area, it doesn't give you the actual feel for Thanet Place, which is a very small, compact area, very much sort of old Croydon, and you're not being shown that particular aspect in the presentation that's been given to committee tonight.
Well, we can leave members to decide whether they feel they've seen sufficient information or not. Councillor Wimborne.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of questions. Is there any amenity space for these new apartments? And also, I understand there's asbestos in the roof space. Is this going to be a concern to get it removed?
Thank you. I should have also actually, reminded me that there was an addendum, just to note that to this application, and I believe neighbours have submitted a asbestos report, which the officers have looked through. In terms of the asbestos point, to take that first, control of asbestos is a environmental issue that is controlled by its own separate legislation. We have recommended that a condition be included on this application if it's approved for submission of details. So it's a contaminated land condition, and specialists within the council would then assess the details submitted. And there are controls over how that asbestos would have to be removed, so it will be removed under controlled circumstances. Turning to the other point, in terms of amenity space, whilst policy does seek to achieve amenity space for new flats, unfortunately in this case we don't have any amenity space. It is a conversion of an existing property where sometimes it's not, we're not able to achieve amenity space. In this case, the site is located within the opportunity area and in an area of high density where we're seeking to increase density of development. The flats are all one-bed units, so not family accommodation, and I'd point to the fact that the existing building also appears to have, whilst there are some small balconies that you can see, I don't believe that all the flats have amenity space. So it is sort of part of the character of the area that there are, and there is accommodation that doesn't necessarily provide that level of amenity space. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Am I right in understanding we're trying to find a little bit more detail in terms of the wider context to the rear? Yes, the heating does seem to have gone off, actually. So we are able to get this onto Google Earth. I think that would be helpful. I mean, I've got it on my screen at the moment, which shows the context as being, yes, there's small, rows of small cottages, but then there's also some very considerable tower blocks immediately behind them, Leon House, and I'm not quite sure what the building facing onto Edridge Road is, but it also has a very dominant impact on the context. Whilst we're looking this up, are there any further questions? If not, I'm going to suggest that we actually hear from the people who wish to speak to us on this application, and then we'll hopefully get that. No, here we are.
Okay, so this is a Google or Bing image, aerial view. Can you all see it? Yeah, so this is the application site. And then this is Thanet Close. You've got a couple of more modern blocks here. I believe this is houses, and then some flats. And then you've got some terrace of properties here. Might even be able to spin it, sorry. So I don't know whether that helps at all. So you do have some dormers to other properties in the area, and you've got some larger development, quite close proximity.
I'm just wondering whether, while we're having the speakers with us, whether we could look at some Google Street View. Can we get Google Street View?
I can.
To actually get down onto... Sorry.
Right, whilst we try and find more images, I am going to ask the people who wish to address us to do so. We have Jan Kool and Rajesh Kahira, I think it is. And we also have Councillor Vidya Mohan as well. So, Mr. Kool and Mr. Kahira, apologies for the pronunciation. Have you decided between you how you're going to split the time? You're taking the whole 3 minutes? Okay, fine. So if you wouldn't mind turning the microphone on, when you're ready, please, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, good evening. I'm speaking on behalf of all the residents and owners of Thanet House. We appreciate that there is a housing shortage in London and the South East, but we believe that this proposal is an unnecessary overdevelopment given what it actually aims to deliver. There's a concurrent redevelopment of Leon House within a quarter of a mile of Thanet House, delivering 263 new properties into the market by mid-2018. What this development aims to deliver is less than 3% of that total. In addition, Central Cross, a property you've recently referenced on the corner of Lower Coombe Street and the High Street, has delivered another 90 properties into the market, not all of which have been sold or let several months after completion. 3 of the proposed properties are designated one person with a total surface area of approximately 37 square metres. However, drawings clearly show double beds and there is no means of restricting occupation, so approval would be potentially approving substandard housing being developed into the market. In addition, the 2-person properties only just scrape the minimum requirement of 50 square metres. In addition, we are not satisfied that the building can support the additional mass. Other local developments have taken place under vacant possession. Thanet House is an inhabited dwelling containing 32 residential units. This proposal will seriously impact the quiet enjoyment of the properties as laid down as tenants' rights in their leases. The development, according to the planning officer's report, will involve cladding the building in scaffolding for what is described as a short period, but it is undetermined and a reasonable estimate will be a period of at least 6 months. Access to daylight is already an issue on the north face of this building, and this will exacerbate the problem. It will also pose a security risk, not to mention the additional health hazards posed by the inconvenience of dirt, dust and debris from the conversion. The proposed development to squeeze 7 additional tiny properties into the roof space will create a significant and disproportionately negative impact and inconvenience for the existing residents. We feel the freeholders' efforts would be better deployed in improving the condition of the existing building. There is a lack of an adequate fire escape. There is only one way in and out of each part of this building, and this may present an unacceptable risk to the residents of the new properties in the event of fire. Unacceptable noise levels will be created by the misalignment of the new flats over the existing properties. We will have, for example, bathrooms over bedrooms and so on, and this will cause a disturbance on an ongoing basis. It's already been referred to that there is asbestos in the roof space, and it was claimed in the planning officer's report that there was none. This is demonstrably false, and it actually suggests that there has not been rigorous or robust scrutiny of the planning application. The planning officer's comments that there isn't any, but it will be dealt with accordingly if it is there. Sorry, I'm about to repeat the same point there, beg your pardon. But there is no method statement of how it will be dealt with. Its removal from an inhabited building, even in accordance with laid down and approved procedures, will still pose a significant health risk to all residents. In summary, we strongly oppose this planned development on the grounds outlined. Whilst we appreciate the pressure on housing, we feel that this development would do very little to alleviate that, and that this proposed development lacks both credibility and merit.
Thank you very much. I will have to stop you there.
That's
no,
it.
well, I've actually finished. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And Councillor Mohan, you've got 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak against this application on behalf of residents of my ward. I think there are two main concerns. Firstly is the overdevelopment of this property. There are already 32 flats in this building, and you're squeezing 7 additional flats into the roof space. I think this will have a very detrimental impact on the amenities and the quality of life of the existing residents. And I think this is certainly, this is not a development site for what is being proposed. The second main concern is really the quality of the habitable space and what is being proposed. The officer's report claims that the minimum requirement of habitable space of 50 metres squared is being met, but I think there are serious concerns about this, and I really request the committee to go and ask the officers to give you a flat-by-flat breakdown of what the actual habitable space is, and I believe some of them might be just below this or marginally above. There is also, the officer's report says that 3 of the bedrooms will not have proper windows and will just have skylight windows. Now, seriously, is this the quality of housing and accommodation we want to provide residents here in Croydon? There are other concerns as well. The asbestos has already been raised. A report in 2004 clearly stated that there was asbestos in the building. The residents are adamant that nothing has been done to date to remove the asbestos, so this is a serious concern, though I appreciate that it's not a grounds for refusal. I think there are concerns of whether the foundation of the current building can actually take the additional load of these flats. There's no lift for those living in the top floor, and there is, I understand, no proper fire escape. And I think we should also refer to the previous application in 1994. Okay, I appreciate it's a long time ago, but when it was refused, and one of the grounds that it refused of was the fact that this was an over-intensive development of the site. And I think that particular reason is still very valid. This is certainly an overdevelopment, and I would urge you to consider this application very carefully. So basically, we have 2 major points of where we're objecting. One is the fact that it is an overdevelopment, and secondly, really, is the quality of the housing and the size of the housing that is being provided. This is a poor application trying to squeeze housing into a space that is really not fit for habitation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Have we managed to get any further images illustrated? I mean, that one there on the screen now sort of gives an impression of the scale of the buildings behind, but do we have something further? Ah, right. I'm afraid you're not able to. So I'm sorry, I can't. No, thank you. I can't let you. I can't bring you back in again. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we can't get down the side on these. No. Yeah. You can glimpse it. I think the better view was the aerial, I'm afraid.
Okay, well that sort of gives a feel for so that they have a significant impact, those towers, on the environment. I think is the case. So, are we able to confirm that?
Sorry, yeah, they do.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, if I could ask the officers to give us any further concluding sort of comments. I'm sure they will already, but they might want to touch on the building control issues, impact during construction, asbestos, unit sizes, and the 1994 refusal.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to start with the 1994 refusal. Yes, there is, and it's in the papers. There has been a previous refusal for additional accommodation in the roof, and that was at a time when the need for housing isn't as acute as it is now. And we feel that the balance in favour of this scheme in terms of additional housing does point this committee towards a positive approach to additional housing. So we feel that that is quite a historic consent and, refusal, and should be given limited weight. This site is within the opportunity area, and it's, again, with all development in the opportunity area, we seek to maximise development opportunities, and we feel it is a substantial roof void at the moment, and it can accommodate residential accommodation, albeit with extensions, and we feel that that is totally appropriate within this particular location. It's in an area that's very high PTAL as well, so it's not reliant upon car parking at all. And it's a location where people want to enjoy the amenities that are available within the town centre. They might not be open spaces, but there are lots of other amenities where people, particularly single and people sharing, will enjoy the opportunities that are available, particularly down Southend and the restaurant quarter, etc. So we feel that the principle of bringing residential accommodation to this building is acceptable. Moving on to issues in the relationship with Thanet Place itself, the properties at the back are already significantly overlooked by this particular property as well as its neighbours. And whilst we appreciate that there's more windows and more, potentially more overlooking, it doesn't make it significantly worse in terms of mostly overlooking to people's rear gardens. So we're satisfied with the impact of those additional dormers in terms of overlooking. I think, and I fully understand and appreciate the points that the residents have been making about activity and development going on in the block that they live. And there have been issues, as we've heard, around asbestos, and the report does mention issues of asbestos. And I know the case officer has been talking to the developer about how that is being managed, although it is something that is not a planning consideration directly. It's something that clearly the developer will have to deal with under the environmental health legislation, but also in terms of constructing these extensions, we'll have to deal with it through the building regulations, and that includes means of escape in the case of fire and also loading and other issues. So we're satisfied that they can be controlled and properly dealt with under other legislation, although, Chair, we are suggesting and recommending a construction logistics plan, which I think goes a bit further than the normal construction logistics around how vehicles get there, but it's actually how the development is taking place and how they are dealing with the existing residents and how. So I think that can be at least capture some of the issues I think that the residents are raising as part of how this development might come forward. I think I'll leave it there I think I've covered the points that you specifically raised, Chair, and I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just to be absolutely clear, if there are issues with the fire escape provision, the foundations, the ability to be able to remove the asbestos, those sorts of things, which aren't being decided tonight, they will be decided by building control. And if those can't be addressed adequately to the acceptance of building control, this will not be able to go ahead.
That's correct, although there need to be some significant changes to that to satisfy our colleagues in building control.
Okay, thank you. It's quite important to get that distinction right between building control and what building control decides and controls, and what we can control here. Okay, then, I'll open this to the committee. Councillor Kabir.
Chair, this is being in an opportunities zone and being in town centre. It's giving opportunity for additional homes, smaller homes for young people and, maybe who are first-time buyers. So I'm going to support this considering because it's in the opportunity zone. It's not the best of the area. I mean, already this particular building is overlooked by another building. So what is new here? So I'm going to move for approval.
Thank you. Does I see Councillor Wimborne? And then Councillor Clancy, and then myself.
Thank you, Chairman. This development, which is in my ward, does not improve or enhance this building. There is no lifts, and these flats are at the top of the building. There's no amenity space, and the size of the units are not, it appears, what they should be. There's a lot of concern over the asbestos and concern about the inadequate fire escape. I would therefore like to move refusal on the ground of an overdevelopment. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, is it clear from the comment there in terms of what the overdevelopment would constitute?
Yes, thank you, Chair. When we're talking about overdevelopment, I think in terms of clarifying what you mean by overdevelopment, you know, I mean, we've had many discussions at this committee around the elements of development and the impact.
Bearing in mind there are merely 32 currently flats in this 1930s building, I think these additional flats will be too much for the building.
Sorry, Councillor Member, I need to press you further about what the impact of those additional units might be in terms of...
I think it will have an adverse effect on the current residents who live there.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Clancy.
Thank you, Chair. Like Councillor Wimborne, I feel also that this feels like an overdevelopment and it's just squeezing too much in. It's a proposal that will definitely affect the amenity of the existing residents. And the existing residents do have concerns with the format of the design, in particular, as has been described, locating bathrooms over bedrooms, for example, doesn't seem to me desirable. So I would urge the developer to consult better with the existing residents. As we've heard, the existing residents also have concerns over the small sizes of the proposed units and the use of skylight windows, altogether representing just a substandard form of accommodation. I'm also concerned about the disruption this development is going to have on the existing residents, although I recognise that's not a valid reason in itself to deny permission. And then lastly tonight, as has been already discussed, I can't fully appreciate the impact that this development has on Thanet Place, so I support the recommendation to refuse as expressed by Councillor Wimborne.
Okay, thank you. I'll bring myself in. I'm going to second the move for approval. I think the issues around building control, asbestos, etc., have been clearly addressed in so much as this planning committee can address those. And as was touched on a moment ago, those will have to be satisfactorily addressed to meet current building regulations and asbestos control regulations, etc. The units are of a modest size, but they do meet the current requirements in terms of minimum sizes. And the development will have a modest impact on the overall appearance of the building. I think the greater impact on the properties to the rear will not be so significant as to be unreasonable. There will undoubtedly be disruption to the existing occupiers, but again we see very often roof extensions to buildings of this sort happening, and I think the importance really of having a properly considered building construction logistics plan that addresses those negative impacts and mitigates those negative impacts on existing residents is important. We aren't able to refuse planning consent on the basis of what impact the building works will actually have, I understand. Anyway, that wouldn't be a material consideration. Things have moved on an awful lot since the 1994 refusal. The housing need is very significant. The increase in housing development in the area will go some way to helping that, but we need an awful lot more housing. So I think this is an appropriate scheme, so I second the approval. Can I see Councillor Perry?
Thank you very much, Chairman. I think, for me, I think this scheme will create substandard sort of accommodation in the future. And I think, for me, the issue is the existing building. And this is really sort of a loft conversion gone mad. It's, you know, like a 1930s house. People go up in the loft. That's fine if it's, you know, if it's for mum and dad or whatever. This is a 1930s purpose-built block of flats. It wasn't designed to have this level of intensification added to it. This is clearly an area that could be intensified. You know, it's a main route, but for me, it's the building that's wrong. It isn't the right building to try and intensify that roof void that is there. It's a very awkward shaped building. It's a very awkward void on that building, and I think it will just create substandard accommodation for the future. So that's why I will not be supporting it.
Okay. Anybody further? No? Councillor Prince?
Only just to say, really, that the gain, the housing gain, does seem very modest, sort of 7 one-bedroom flats, but we do need a wide range of sizes of housing. And as you said, Chair, you know, our numerical targets are very high. We do need practically everything we can get our hands on to get anywhere near them. I have every sympathy, actually, with the existing residents for the disturbance, assuming that all the building control issues can be addressed and the asbestos removed safely and so forth. I still have every sympathy with that period of disruption, but I think, on balance, you know, that is a temporary problem, and we really do need the housing, so I should be supporting it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Nobody else wishes to address the committee? In that case, we have 2 motions completed. The first of those was for refusal based on overdevelopment as caused by the impact on the amenity of the existing residents. And that was seconded by Councillor Clancy. And then the second motion was for approval, moved by Councillor Kabir and seconded by myself. So the first of those, can I see those in favour of refusal?
That's 4, Chair.
And those against?
5, Chair.
So that motion falls. The second motion for approval, can I see those in favour?
That's 5, Chair.
And those against?
That's 4, Chair.
So that is approved. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to the next item, item 6.5. Okay, okay, yeah, okay. Okay, presenting officer is Ross. Ross, when you're ready, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. This second item before us for decision this evening is at 43 Downsway. It's for the demolition of the existing house and the subsequent erection of an apartment scheme that appears as 2/3 stories in height from the front and 4 stories to the rear, encompassing 7 flats, 3 3-bedroom units, 2 2-bedroom units and 2 1-bedroom units, together with 5 car parking spaces. So this first slide just shows you the surrounding footprint context. So this is Purley Downs Road, and this is Downsway. I'll come on to the land level changes in a moment, but this just serves to show you the existing footprint of the bungalow and the other 2-storey houses in the vicinity. And on the right-hand side, we have the scheme footprint before us for decision. So it really just serves to show you that it matches very much the front and rear building lines and is relatively consistent in terms of the surrounding footprint. So onto an aerial photograph then. So this is Purley Downs Road. It's really important to consider the land levels, which we'll see in the subsequent photographs. But Purley Downs Road falls in this direction, and there's a more significant land level change falling down Downsway, hence the name of the road. And this property, as I say, the only bungalow, the majority of the properties in the surrounding context are 2-storey properties, is set below the road, and there's an existing boundary wall and hedge that would be retained as part of this scheme. The really important relationships which we'll come on to are to the adjoining property at number 41 Downsway here and the relationship to number 125 Purley Downs Road here in terms of amenity. And it's just worth pointing out that these properties sit at a higher land level. So this is just looking down Downsway. So this is the adjoining property and this is the entrance and the access into the application site. This is the application site here, this is the bungalow, the adjoining property, and you can see the land level changes that I referred to and this treatment that would be retained. We've jumped into the site itself now, so we're looking at the back of the application site. You'll see it's had a relatively sizable single-storey rear extension constructed in the past, and this is the really important relationship to number 41. And you can see that they do have some windows in that flank elevation, which is obviously important for you to consider. And we're now looking back towards the other property I drew attention to, so number 125 Purley Downs Road. That's a significant distance away. There are 2 windows in that flank elevation, but they're high-level windows at ground floor. But you can see with the boundary treatment, that's not visible from this photo. So to the plans then, the black outline is of the existing property. And you'll see the building line has been pulled back to make it very much consistent with number 41, the immediately adjoining property. You'll see the footprint does extend back beyond that property, but is within the 45-degree angle. It's to provide 7 flats, as I said, with a good mix in terms of three three-bedroom units, so family accommodation that's much needed across the borough. It utilises the existing vehicular access with 5 car parking spaces, 1 disabled. You'll have noted from all the photographs that there is capacity on the street in terms of car parking. 7 flats are proposed with 5 car parking spaces. We feel that there's sufficient off-street capacity to account for any extra car parking as a result. In terms of the layout then, we have bin and cycle stores. We have a generous communal amenity space to the rear. So to the elevations then, so this is number 41 and this is the proposal. You can see the dotted line of the existing bungalow. Very much 2-storey properties are characteristic of the area, and you'll see the ridge doesn't go any higher than that property. And then obviously we have Purley Downs Road at a higher level, so that wouldn't be read even as a 2-storey building. And then this is the elevation in effect, how it could be seen from Purley Downs Road. Then the rear elevation, and then the elevation looking towards that important adjoining occupier at number 41. And then just really important that you're obviously aware that, as I said, 4 stories to the rear utilising basement accommodation, but that's obviously sunken, so you wouldn't really see it from the immediate locale. This just shows you a bit of a 3D rendered image of how the scheme could look. And I'll leave you with this final slide that is a more colourful image. You'll see it's 2-storey with a 3rd-storey element. And in terms of the developer that we have that's presented this, in terms of Aventia, it's fair to say this is a more bespoke design than we've had in the past, and that's something that we as officers support. The recommendation is to grant planning permission. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for clarification? Councillor Clancy?
Are any of the parking spaces disabled?
Yes, one of the spaces is disabled.
And in terms of the availability of on-street parking, we saw from the images there that it would appear that there is a good level of on-street parking available. Are we confident that that is sufficient to warrant there not being one-for-one parking provision on the site?
Yes, that's correct. And in the context of promoting sustainable transport modes, the officers and strategic transport are fully supportive of 5 spaces as proposed.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have Mr. King wishing to address us on this application as an objector. Do we have Mr. Nash here, who is the agent? Yeah. And also we have Councillor Hale, who is a referring ward member. So, starting with Mr. King. Mr. King, you have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns, please, when you're ready.
I am Chairman of the Sanderstead Residents Association, and I'm a chartered architect, now retired. Mr Nayner's report states, in terms of recent planning history, number 43 Downsway, following the applications are considered relevant. Planning application 12-1495 was refused in 2012 for a single-storey extension of number 43. Reason, it will be detrimental to the amenities of the adjoining property by reason of its size, siting, resulting in loss of life and visual intrusion. The report continues, a second planning application was approved in October 2012. Reason, the previous concern of the 5.1 metre high roof, the ridge 12.5 metres from the boundary, with number 41 was reduced in height and thus obtained approval. The Aventia development now proposed is 8 metres high and only 1.8 metres from the boundary, 2.8 from number 41. Because number 43 is directly south of number 41 and 8 metres high, the side windows of number 41 will lose their sunlight and always be in shade. Also, number 43 extends 3 metres beyond the garden facing wall of number 41, which is towards the east. Because the sun has to rise over the Sanderstead Hills above Downsway, the first early morning sunrise of midsummer sun will never shine on the windows in the garden facing wall, the terrace and much of the garden. The back of number 41 will always be in shade. The terrace and garden will also be overlooked by 2 Velux windows, a protective condition of October 2012 approval. Number 3 of the key reasons for recommendations in the Planning Officer's report is the living conditions of adjoining occupiers would be protected from undue harm. The living conditions of the adjoining occupier are definitely not protected and are seriously harmed. If the report states the history of the 2012 applications are considered relevant to this application, it must therefore be firmly refused. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind turning the microphone off, please, that would be most appreciated. And now we have Mr Nash, who is the applicant's agent. You have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your application. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Planning Department. We had extensive pre-application discussions with officers at the Council, and that advice helped to shape the design of the proposals that you see before the committee today. I don't want to necessarily go over the application too much because it was summed up very well by the Planning Officer, but essentially it will provide up to 7 new dwellings, which will include 3 family-sized dwellings. The units will, of course, contribute positively to the borough's housing targets. Just a couple of key points in terms of the design. The design has been chosen to replicate the appearance of a single dwelling house, follows much the same similar design process as other Aventia schemes. The height of the building, as noted as well, is also, despite the topography, no greater than the neighbouring property. This, combined with the traditional design, will ensure that the proposals are in keeping with the area, which is predominantly for large detached dwellings. On residential amenity, the site does benefit from its corner location, so it's adjacent to the road. The impacts, of course, are largely focused on number 41, but with regards to that property, the building has been set back in line with the front building line of the street. The projection beyond the rear elevation of number 41 has been reduced versus the original scheme that was put forward to pre-app advice. And the first floor balconies to the rear have been recessed to minimise side views. In terms of overlooking, we don't consider that it would be any different to overlooking from a 2-storey dwelling versus the bungalow that is there at the moment. And the building has been designed, as I say, so it's no taller than number 41 to reduce any potential daylight and sunlight impacts. In terms of the quality of accommodation, the proposal will provide good quality accommodation, with the majority of units having access to private external amenity space. Those units which don't will have access to the large communal space to the rear. Parking, 5 off-street car parking spaces, which we consider to be sufficient for the number of dwellings that are proposed. And in terms of the public benefits, as I say, we will deliver 7 residential units, which will include 3 family-sized units, financial contributions via the Community Infrastructure Levy, a good quality design, delivery of extensive landscaping and biodiversity benefits, and short-term economic impact effects during construction. In terms of daylight and sunlight, just to come up on some points that the gentleman raised, yes, the extension does project 3 metres beyond the rear elevation of number 41, but this is within the guidelines of the BRE guidelines, the 45-degree rule, as drawn from the corner of number 41, that the rear elevation of the building will be set behind that line. But otherwise, I think that's everything from me, so thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Councillor Hale. You have up to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. There is so much to object to with this over-intensive application on this corner site, such as the access, insufficient on-site parking provision, the impact of overspill parking and highway safety issues. The density, it exceeds the London Plan recommendations and is thus significantly out of character with neighbouring properties. But my main concern is for the living conditions of adjoining occupiers, and in particular the residents of the property immediately next door to the site at number 41. The application site at number 43 sits considerably higher than number 41, and because it's located immediately south of number 41, it was deliberately constructed as a bungalow to prevent overshadowing and therefore allowing the sun to shine on number 41 and for natural light to enter the property and garden. Previous applications for number 43 have taken this into full consideration and have reflected the significant topography of this site, and a past refusal for a 5-metre high roof, 12.5 metres from the boundary, respected this. This application for the erection of a large property just 1.8 metres from the boundary and 8 metres high therefore seems completely illogical and means the residents of number 41 will suffer overlooking, loss of privacy, and by putting it completely in the shade, complete lack of natural sunlight. It's fully recognised that light is critical in the maintenance of good mental health and that a lack of sunlight is associated with reduced cognitive function among depressed people. Housebound people in particular need access to natural light in their homes and gardens, and to deliberately take away someone's access to sunlight seems to me to be completely unacceptable. I would invite you to have another look at the photograph of the bungalow's relationship with number 41 as seen from Purley Downs Road. Add on the roof height of this proposal and it will tower above number 41. In summary, the application fails to respect the significant changes in land levels and the appalling effect which such a large dominant building will have on the living conditions of the occupiers of number 41. Loss of sunlight, overshadowing to the detriment of residential amenity and overlooking are all substantial material planning considerations, and I hope you will therefore refuse this application. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Do officers have anything further to add? Can I ask, actually, maybe a quick sort of further statement on the impact or potential impact on number 41?
Yeah, a couple of things. Obviously, as Mr. King has quite rightly pointed out, there is previous history on this, and the planning officer, Robert Naylor, did fully consider the previously refused scheme. That was, albeit it was single-storey in nature, it did have a roof that matched that of the maximum height of the bungalow, and it was deeper than what we have presented before us this evening. That's the first point. The second point in that is that was 6 years ago, and a lot has changed in terms of planning policy and promotion of schemes like this in terms of housing need. And then the third point is the windows in the flank elevation of number 41 that I showed you in the photograph are all secondary windows to rooms that have windows in the front and rear elevations of that property. So we're not hiding the fact that there is going to be some impact, but we do not feel that impact is so unacceptable to refuse permission.
And Chair, if I could add to that in terms of the addendum that we've put before the committee this evening, you know, sites like this where you have sloping sites and relationships with neighbouring properties, we want to make sure that the drawings that are before us we can properly control through monitoring on site and making sure that the developers are building in accordance with the drawing. So we are recommending in this particular case, because of the change in the levels, that we have finished floor levels are actually approved and dealt with as part of an ongoing detailed plan, so that the relationship with the neighbouring property and also how it relates to Purley Downs Road is actually properly managed. So that's a further condition we are recommending, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Could we just have a quick look at the back elevation again? The sort of... And then on the drawings of the proposed. Okay, right. And then can we just look at the plan, the floor plan you had there as well? Okay, fine. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, over this to the committee. Councillor Perry.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm slightly concerned. I mean, we've just flicked through the plans again there. It's quite clear from the images we've seen tonight that the bungalow pretty much sits like for like with number 41 Downs Way, and yet that's looked to be replaced with a 4-storey development that will sit virtually at the same level. So I think the floor levels are going to be very crucial on this scheme, because I have concerns that this perhaps isn't being shown in the scale that it may actually end up on site. Having said that, it's clearly a huge intensification of this site, and I think it will have a detrimental impact on the local character. It's a very prominent corner plot, and this will be a very dominant building sitting on that plot. And I think the impact for 41 Downs Way, it will be totally dominated. And the pictures we've seen tonight, to some degree, even the bungalow dominates 41, and yet we're looking to put a 4-storey development in place of a bungalow, extend it further into the back garden, so it's actually deeper than 41. The impact will be terrible for 41, and I don't think that's a price that the residents of this borough should have to pay. Clearly, the site could be developed, but I don't think this is the right scheme. So I would move refusal as an overdevelopment by dint of its size and massing, causing loss of amenity for adjoining occupiers.
Okay, Councillor Clancy, and I'll bring myself in.
Thanks, Joe. I agree with Councillor Perry's analysis. I also feel that this is just too much being squeezed in. It's an over-intensification, and let's be honest, with units in the basement and in the roof space, this is a 4-storey development. And it will have a detrimental impact on neighbours with loss of light that is described that they're going to feel to their property. It will have an overbearing nature and a negative impact on the amenities of the neighbours in that respect as well, due to its visual dominance. It's outside the recommended density levels by quite a margin. And let's not forget that 3 of the units are actually under the minimum space standards requirements, and it's only by 3 square metres, but that's still a fair amount of space. Why should we compromise? So overall, I second Councillor Perry's motion to refuse permission.
Okay, thank you. And Mr Smith, want to come in on a particular point?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting, when we talk about storey heights, and it comes up quite a lot in our discussions of this committee about how you look at storey heights and decide whether it's 4-storey, whether it's 2-storey with rooms in the roof and a basement. And I think what's important, and if Ross, you could go to the elevation fronting onto Downs Way, if somebody looks at that, I would call that 2-storey with rooms in the roof. You could quite easily take out the windows in that gable and the roof lights and still call that 2-storey. And I think it's very, and again, what's in a word, what's in a phrase, but I think it's quite important to bear that in mind in terms of when we're thinking, and because what we should be assessing and what we assess as officers and what this committee should is the view of that development, irrespective of how many stories it is. It's how does it appear in the street, how does it appear in relation to the neighbour, irrespective of how many stories. And I think we sometimes get, with all due respect, a bit bogged down in stories rather than the appearance of that development and how it impacts on its neighbours. I think that's quite important, just to sort of bring us back to understanding what the issues are, if I may, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I want to sort of pick up on that sort of point, really. I mean, it's this is a site that can clearly support intensification. It's on a corner site. At the moment, there is a very modest building there at the moment. If anything, is out keeping with the immediate context. And yet, building a what is technically a 4-storey but clearly appears as a two-storey with accommodation in the roof scale of building, then with a partial basement to give it that fourth level and additional accommodation, family accommodation. I think, as the drawing that we can see on the screen now will fit very well. It fits in with the sort of relates to the roof levels of the surrounding buildings, and yet at the same time, incredibly importantly, adding an additional 6 homes to the provision within the borough. I think the design has been well considered. It clearly has that appearance of a large detached house, but accommodating 7 homes in total. The impact, there will be some impact on the neighbour at number 41, clearly, but most of the impact is on the side windows, and those side windows, as is described in the report, are all secondary windows to rooms that have a window looking out the back or looking out the front. Yes, there may be some impact on the sunlight to the rear, daylight to the rear. The house will still receive a good level of daylighting and sunlighting, though, quite clearly, despite there being some impact. Density levels, it's interesting, of course, now that the much maligned, probably regretted, ever actually included in the London Plan density matrix is now going to be dropped. It's interesting, I was hearing yesterday that apparently 50% of all of the schemes granted consent since that density guidance matrix was introduced have exceeded it, and I think 25% of them have gone at least double the matrix. That matrix is a flawed piece of policy guidance, and it was only ever intended as guidance anyway. We're moving on. We have a housing crisis that we need to address. So I think, all in all, a well-considered scheme. I think it will work well in this site. I'm content that the sort of under-provision from a one-to-one point of view of parking can be accommodated on the street. Many of our streets accommodate, obviously, the parking for surrounding properties. So, all in all, I think it's a good scheme, and I'm happy to move approval. Councillor Wright, and then Councillor Prince.
Thank you, Chairman. And I hear what Mr. Smith says regarding the stories, etc., and I see where he's coming from. But I think this doesn't detract from the fact that it is a dominant building, and particularly from the rear angle. And that, I think, is what is concerning members, is that not necessarily whether it's 2, 3, 4 or 4 stories. It's the fact of the appearance and the dominant appearance, and that, I think, is a very relevant point and should be borne in mind. Could I also mention that in 821 it mentions that there's a critical damage from flood risk area, and that, I think, is well known from people who live in the area, and I think that's very important, particularly because it has a very critical land level changes and the slopes, and that by having this extra large building on this site, it will exacerbate that. I'm very pleased that we've got permeable materials written in the conditions, and I've been talking about this for a long time, and I'm pleased that it's now beginning to come into the conditions, and that's what it is. But I just wonder if the condition on landscaping and suds is sufficient with that permeable material, because the flood element is a critical angle and it needs to be very carefully addressed when it comes to that. So all in all, Mr. Chairman, I really can't support this because I don't think it's the right building in the right site. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith, are you able to come back on the flooding point?
Well, as I say, the condition that we are recommending is to be, the scheme to be dealt with in compliance with the flood risk assessment that was submitted as part of the application. I think, we need to look more, Chair, into, I'm not totally familiar personally with the detail of the flood risk, but that would cover mitigation to deal with surface water drainage. If members want further detail to be considered as part of a detailed SUDS condition as well, then I think that would be an appropriate way forward. Notwithstanding the details that have been included within the flood risk assessment. I don't know whether Mr. Gentry might help me out, or whether there's any further to say.
Yeah, the flood risk assessment proposes certain sustainable urban drainage schemes. So we're confident that they can do it, and we take obviously flooding incredibly seriously on all schemes. I mean, we will consider it whether it's within the landscaping condition or whether it's a standalone. So we'd be happy in either scenario, but rest assured it's very serious, and it is something that the developer is taking on board and will be held to account to.
So the flood risk as a result of this development would not be increased? No. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Prince.
I just wanted to say really that I'd like to second your motion for approval, Chair. I think the factor that affects me the most is that of these 7 new units, 3 of them I think are going to be 3-bedroom family housing, which obviously we are in great need of, and I'm sure that the other families along the road would be grateful for family housing if they were in need of it, as indeed possibly their children may be. So that's my main reason, I think, for supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? In that case, we have 2 motions completed before us. First, for refusal on grounds of overdevelopment because of the size and massing and impact on a neighbouring property. Moved by Councillor Perry and seconded by Councillor Clancy. And then moved for approval, moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Prince. So first those for refusal. Can I see those in favour of refusal?
That's 4, Chair.
And those against?
That's 5, Chair.
So that motion falls. Can I see those in favour of approval?
That's 5, Chair.
And those against?
4, Chair.
That is then approved. Thank you. Now, I think now if we have a couple of minutes, well, say 5 minutes break, we'll reconvene at 10:02. Okay? Thank you. We're going to restart. Thank you very much. We are trying to get the heating to come back on again, but we can't guarantee that it will. So dress up warm. Okay, on to item 6.4, Fairview Road, Norbury. Presenting officer is Nicola Townsend. Are you ready, please, Nicola?
Thank you, Chair. I'll just wait for the lights to... Thank you. The application before you this evening is for 32 to 34 Fairview Road. It's for the demolition of the existing buildings on site and construction of a Part 2, 3 and 4-storey building to comprise a total of 9 flats, which would be split as 1 one-bedroom, 7 two-bedroom and 1 three-bedroomed, and 1 commercial unit as well. The application site is located in Norbury, and yep, you can see on the screen. The site is, I'll say, roughly triangular in shape. It's located in this location here at the end of Fairview Road here. As you can see, the surrounding area is predominantly terraced properties, and at the end of this cul-de-sac is a doctor's surgery in this location here, which is accessed via Fairview Road and to the side of the application site here. You will see in the further photographs, but the current site is occupied by a mixture of commercial units, one of which is still in use as a car repairs garage. In addition to this, on this slide, you can also see London Road, the A23, and the site's proximity to the Norbury District Centre and Norbury Railway Station, which is in this location here. As you can see, the railway lines pass to the north of the application site. So moving down to street level, this photograph is taken of the corner of Fairview Road and Roach Road, and we're looking towards the application site, which comprises these two-storey white buildings in this location here, and the single-storey buildings, which you can just see here. From this photograph, you can see the flank of the properties in Roach Road and the separation distance between the application site and those properties, and you can just start to get a flavour of the terraced properties on the opposite side of the road. As you can also see from this photograph, the site is located within a controlled parking zone. So we now move slightly closer to the application site, and just to give you a little bit more detail, you can see the garage which I referred to in this location here, and the other buildings which form part of the application site. It's also worth noting that just on the edge of the slide here, this is the entrance to the doctor's surgery, and you can see the keep clear signs on the road to ensure access to those premises. We're now looking back in the opposite direction, back towards the junction with Roach Road, and you can see the rear of the adjoining properties in this location here and the application site in front of you. This photograph is effectively taken from within the entrance to the doctor's surgery. And just in a little bit more detail there, you can see our application site just here, the entrance to the surgery and the two-storey building in this location here. The trees that you can see beyond are the trees which effectively are along the railway line, along the side and the embankments of the railway line. So moving on to the ground floor and the layout of the proposed site, as I said, it's almost triangular in shape, and it's proposed that, sorry, I've lost my mouse, that the replacement employment use would be in this location here, and then flats would be arranged taking advantage of the shape of the site and responding to that in this location here. It's worth noting, as members will be aware, the Council has a policy which seeks to protect employment uses on sites such as this. However, all of the site, with the exception of the car garage, has already benefited from prior approval to convert from the existing uses to residential. So under effectively the extended permitted development rights, and therefore it's not appropriate to apply that protection for those employment generating use to the majority of the site, and the applicant is seeking to replace employment generating floor space within the site to compensate for the loss of the garage space as present. So moving on to the elevations, the top image that you can see before you is effectively taken looking from the doctor's surgery, looking from the properties on the opposite side of Fairview Road. So you can see this is the elevation here that would face towards Fairview Road, and this flank elevation here would face towards the doctor's surgery, in order to ensure that there is no overlooking, there are no windows in that elevation, but the applicant has sought to include panels of different brickwork in order to break up that elevation. The middle image is effectively taken looking from the railway line, so we can see part of the building and the balconies serving those residential properties in this location here. And then as the building turns the corner and staggers up the site, you can see the 3 or 4 different flanks which then step away from the site in this location here. And then the bottom slide shows you effectively the rear of the property, and you can see that all of the units are provided with outdoor amenity space in the form of gardens or balconies above. So the top slide effectively shows you the elevation as you would enter from the junction with Roach Road. So this is the taller element which would face towards that junction, and you can see the flank elevations of the building. Closest to the rear of the property is in Roach Road. The property is actually 2-storey and single-storey, and then steps up in height further away. So you can see the 2-storey element just here set back. And the image at the bottom is an artist's impression of how the development would appear as you enter from the junction with Roach Road. And finally, an image of the development from Fairview Road. The recommendation is for approval.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions, clarification? I've got a couple myself. Firstly, the photographs that we've seen suggest that there's actually quite a lot of parking associated with the existing garage use, not surprisingly, with cars double parked outside. What would be the parking provision with the scheme as proposed? What would happen to that area of road up there? I mean, I appreciate there's one parking space actually proposed on the site, but would this then mean that that area of road would be kept even clearer for the what's clearly very important access into the health centre? And secondly, that important point about the health centre, I guess that we've all received sort of correspondence about this. Would the access to the health centre be impeded either during construction or subsequently as a result of the development?
So first of all, yes, as you can see from the photograph, there are a number of vehicles which are double parked outside the site, certainly at the time that our officer made the site visit. As part the application site, the red line boundary is effectively at the back edge of the pavement. So this area in front of the site, is my understanding, is that is public footway and highway. It is proposed that one disabled car parking space would be proposed as part of the development. As I showed you earlier on in my presentation, the site is incredibly close to the amenities of the Norbury District Centre and Norbury Railway Station. It is proposed in the application conditions that if members were minded to grant planning permission, that we'd also apply a condition preventing future occupiers, with the exception of disabled occupiers, from applying for parking permits for the area. In terms of that area outside the site, it is outside the site, so it would return to being footway, highway, and that would be in the council's control as to whether that was then able to facilitate further designated bays, or whether it be more appropriate to keep that area more open, bearing in mind the adjoining use. That would be a matter for my highways colleagues to consider what would be the appropriate thing to do with that area. Turning now to your second point, which was in relation to the access to the health centre, the doctor's surgery next door. Clearly, it's very important. I think, as we've discussed on applications earlier this evening, we have also recommended that a construction logistics plan condition be attached if members are minded to grant planning permission. Such a condition would such a document would need to be tightly tied down times of deliveries, size of vehicles of deliveries during the construction period, to ensure that any disruption is kept to a minimum. It is a cul-de-sac, so there is potential for some disruption, I think it's fair to say, but a tightly worded construction logistics plan should ensure that is minimised. A construction logistics plan has a couple of aims. First of all is to minimise disruption to the highway, and also to control sort of noise and delivery times and impacts on environment. So that would be considered in quite a lot of detail by our colleagues in environmental health and within our highways team.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. With regard to the two main buildings that are on the site, has there been much consideration of the heritage value of those two buildings?
Those properties are not within a conservation area, nor are they listed or included on our local list of properties of heritage value. As you will be aware, the documents for the CLP2 are currently being considered, and they're not proposed to be listed or locally listed, and therefore their demolition would not be contrary to policy, and they're not protected.
Councillor Prince, then Councillor Wimborne.
Yes, I'm not clear about the employment use. There is going to continue to be one commercial unit, but will that be the garage, or a similar replacement repair garage, which would presumably bring with it all the parking problems that we've just been discussing, or would it be office or what?
So the application proposes a mixture of possible uses for the commercial units, which ranges from B1B, sort of light industry, through to B2. As you can see from the slide I've just pulled up, the commercial unit would be in this location here. To me, it's quite a good size, but the suggested layout at the front and the disabled car parking space here, which would be allocated for the flats, would suggest to me that that would not necessarily in its layout be appropriate for a garage use, so that would go. But obviously it would be marketed for those appropriate uses to find a use that could be accommodated and would use those spaces. Obviously, with the way technology advances, different kinds of spaces are required for those kinds of employment users. We have recommended in the addendum just an expanded condition that should it be a B2 use, that full details of its hours of operation and sort of sound insulation be submitted to us prior to that use commencing. B2 users tend to be the noisier users, which is what a garage would be classed as. So a garage is already operating in a residential area, but just to make sure that any future use can be controlled and can operate appropriately in its surroundings, we've proposed a wider condition on the addendum.
B2 wouldn't seem to be hugely appropriate if it could be a garage type use. Would it be within our gift to restrict it to B1B, B1C?
If obviously the applicant has applied for a wider range of uses, but if members felt it appropriate to limit it to that, yes, that would be within your gift to do so.
Councillor Wimborne.
What sort of tree loss is there going to be from this application, and will there be any replacement trees?
Yep, as you can see from your report, yes, there are trees that are proposed to be lost as part of the application. Because of the site's location, adjacent to the railway line, which you can see in this location here, there are a number of trees both within the embankment of the railway line belonging to Network Rail, and there are some trees within the boundary here and here. So yes, trees would be lost, but adequate screening would be retained along the railway line. There would be limited room for significant tree planting, but certainly a landscaping scheme is proposed as part of the development. All of the trees have been considered, which are proposed to be lost, have been considered by our tree officer, who has considered them to be Category C trees or to suffer from some kind of problem, and therefore he's not raised an objection to their removal.
Thank you. That's all the questions. We have a number of people wishing to address us. Mr Cross and Mr Crichton, who are objectors, and we also have Councillor Shafi Khan, who is one of the referring members. So if you'd like to come forward, please. And just for clarity, whilst Councillor Khan was sitting on the committee earlier on for this particular item, because he has referred it, he isn't taking part in the decision making. So, gentlemen, objectors, have you agreed between you how you're going to split your time?
Yes. 50-50.
50-50. Do you wish us to time keep for you, which would be our recommendation, or do you wish to time keep yourselves? It's just that sometimes people get a little bit carried away and they forget to give the agreed time to the second person.
Do the work.
Okay, we will do that then. Fine. And so who's going first? Okay, Mr Cross, you have 1.5 minutes. When you're ready, please.
I am the practice manager of Fairview Medical Centre, a high-performing GP surgery which has been at the site for over 20 years with about 8,000 patients and is still expanding. Surgery is at the bottom of an already narrow road, incidentally much more narrow than those pictures you just saw. The developers have not consulted with the surgery, nor considered any of the surgery's current or future needs, and we, our landlord and the CCG, are extremely concerned about the impact, particularly on access and the safety of 8,000 Northbury residents. Vehicles need to get in for the sick and disabled patient, doctors, deliveries and collections of tests. There are medical emergencies which need ambulances of the patient to be taken quickly to hospital. Without guaranteed access, both during development and permanently, then patient safety will be at risk, and both doctors and NHS England would question the ongoing viability of the surgery. It would help if the development works are not allowed to impinge on the pathway or roadway, and the builder's vehicles or deliveries are banned in weekday working hours. Ongoing, there should be no parking rights for the new building and no parking on one side of the road. However, since the proposal takes the whole footprint of the site, which is bordered by a railway, the road, and also at the side by land we rent, then realistically, access can only be assured by also cutting the size of the project. Any idea otherwise is just unsupported wishful thinking. In short, the development for few new people is not just extremely disruptive to the healthcare needs of 8,000 residents, but would be unsafe.
Mr Cross, thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind turning your microphone off, please. And Mr Crichton, when you're ready, please. You've got 1.5 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. As an individual, I'm registered with a medical practice, and I fully endorse what has just been said, but of course I'm here for the Norbury Residents Association Planning Committee. As a large development on a tight site, this scheme has been badly thought through in terms of its impact on the medical practice and the short stretch of the road. It is overdevelopment and badly designed, as outlined in our letter of objection, which I emailed to you. For you to be satisfied that the scheme is good design, the planning officer should cite those elements which meet the requirements of your planning policies. In para 7.6 of the report, reference is made to the scheme contributing to family housing. 2-bed, 4-person units are cramped family housing. They do not comply with policy that housing should be designed for lifetime change, such as when children of opposite gender need their own bedrooms. There will be a lot of noise from the railway. Could this result in broken sleep, which will be detrimental to children's health and well-being? There are planning grounds for you to refuse this application, but if you do not agree, then I ask you to take into consideration that the developer failed to consult the medical practice in the light of his objections to the GPDOs. You could consider deferring the application to enable discussion of a redesign that would relocate the commercial unit to enable expansion of the practice's accommodation and ensure that access to the practice does not get blocked. Thank you.
I'm afraid your time's up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, and then finally, Councillor Conn, you have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And the committee member, can I draw your attention to the previous history of this planning application? If you go through the paper, you will see that previously it was approved for 3 flats only. And at the moment, we are talking about 9 flats. I do appreciate it's a site to be developed, but I think it is a constrained site. As been mentioned, then every effort was made to maximize the number of flats. And I'm sure probably of course it would comply. I do have trust on our officer. They will not allow something like that. I'm sure it does comply with the required dimension. But the question is, will we be able to sling a cat inside the flat? That's the problem. So I have a bit difficulties to understand. Of course, we appreciate we need housing, we need homes for people, not only just a box. And on that ground, I would say that lack of amenity spaces for the incoming resident, and also the site is very close to the railway line. Just imagine the vibration, noise, what sort of quality we are talking about. And also, during the construction period, and the practice manager did mention that people who come to this practice, some of my constituents, like from Freeman's Court and a couple of Norbury Hall and a couple of other places where people are quite elderly, vulnerable, they need wheelchair to come, and very often we have ambulances there. And during the construction, I cannot imagine how that could be mitigate these problems, how the residents will come to get their services from the GP. So it is quite difficult. And also traffic, you can see from there, not very far from that site, there is a co-op store. People do come there to shop, and also people park on those bays to go and do the shopping in district centre. And we are encouraging to offer 1 hour free parking or half an hour free parking wherever possible, district centres, to do shopping so that people can come and spend money locally to support the local businesses. And if we put more pressure, people will not be able to use that facilities. And I would say that on ground of overdevelopment and effect on the medical centre, as rightly said, I don't want to see that medical centre closed, because then 8,000 patients will be distributed to other practices, and those practices are already over, I would say, subscribed. And because I'm also a member of one of the locals, and I know how difficult it is to get an appointment. and also
Khan?
traffic. On these three,
Councillor Khan, I'm afraid your time is up.
I just want to say the overdevelopment, effect on medical centre, traffic and parking. These are the
time
issues.
is up. Sorry. Thank you very much. Okay, do officers have anything further they wish to add? And obviously addressing the point around the impact on the doctor surgery is probably the key one.
Absolutely. I just want to make 3 points. The first one, responding to Councillor Khan's comments. Back in the history, yes, we have had given prior approval for 3 flats in one of those buildings and 3 flats in the other. And it really shows what a difficulty we have with prior approval and the general permitted development on things that don't need planning permission. Going back to quality of flats, the quality of flats in residential conversions through prior approval can be a lot worse in terms of floor space and amenities compared with something that's bespoke and something that's been planned. So whilst I appreciate that there have been 6 flats approved already under prior approval, what we would suggest, Chair, is that the quality of the accommodation that's coming forward as part of a planned development is significantly enhanced compared to relying on permitted development. Although, as Ms Townsend said, the permitted development also limits the opportunity we had to protect existing employment floor space. That's the first point. The second point is clearly it's important that the medical practice maintains its freedom of access during construction and clearly once the development, if planning permission is granted and things implemented, then following on from that. And the construction logistics, it's quite interesting how, we had a construction logistics discussion on Thanet House earlier, and that's going to be looking at construction logistics, how it's going to affect existing residents within the development. Here we're talking about how we deal with specific issues that are facing a medical practice. So it's very much looking at a bespoke arrangement that we will work with our highway colleagues and environment health colleagues, and clearly, in terms of construction logistics, it's imperative that the applicant talks to you, and it's unfortunate they haven't spoken to you at the moment, to make sure that your interests are protected as part of, and that's, good neighbourliness. And we would be, sometimes when I think after these committees, we should be on the phone to. It's unfortunate the developer isn't here to say something in response. But we will be going back to the applicant and saying that this was a big issue and it's something they need to take very seriously, and we'll be doing that when we communicate next with them. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that we're looking at a car-free scheme here. It gives the council, because it's the highway authority that manages that road, an opportunity to look at how, because they won't have industrial uses there, and therefore deliveries and traffic and everything else could be more controlled, potentially if the residential scheme is car-free and we're managing and controlling how people park as part of that residential scheme. So it could be an opportunity for that street to become much more easier, and in fact in the longer term it could be that access to the medical practice is enhanced. So, Chair, responding to those points, I think we believe it's a scheme that's worthy of a planning permission, and therefore we recommend consent, subject to those very important planning conditions.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Cummings and Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Chair. And I think partly it's been addressed by Mr Smith. I'm really concerned that the medical centre wasn't consulted in terms of the development. I think it's vital. I mean, we all appreciate that housing is so vital in our borough, but we have to actually work with the community. And I know there's obviously got to be planning legislation that guides us in all of this development, but to find a scheme that's actually got to this sort of stage where it hasn't actually consulted with the centre, that actually it impinges on so greatly, I just wonder what the reason was for that, why that is, and whether or not that's something that could be remedied. Whether or not that's in a consideration prior to the decision or not, that's obviously, it depends on how the committee decides.
Yeah, just to come back on that, it's good practice for, and again, the applicant isn't here to respond. I don't, we've heard from the medical practice that they haven't been consulted by the applicant. It's good practice to do that, and with the large applications, we would definitely expect that, and as part of submissions, we would ask for what's called a statement of community involvement, which is a rather grand way of saying who have you spoken to and what response has come back. So it is unfortunate, but I think we will be communicating members' concerns around how there appears to be lack of communication between them. It isn't a reason for refusal, and it's not something that we can require, but it is good practice.
So we're confident then that that can be addressed post a grant of planning consent through the development of the condition. There's no loss of ability to be able to control that at this stage.
Absolutely not, Chair. Absolutely not.
Also, okay. Thank you, Councillor Wright.
Thanks, Chairman. First, say it's a shame that we're going to lose both those quite eloquent buildings, really. They ought to be more concerned, I think, in previous times, perhaps listing them, but that's just happened. There's a shame about that. Going back to what's been discussing about the construction logistics plan, I think that's very key to this whole operation. And my experience is that it's very difficult to police and to enforce. I know that perhaps the construction company will abide by it, but it's the subcontractors usually who disobey. And it is a great problem. What I've seen in various areas in the borough of the subcontractors obeying what the construction plan, because that is the key to it. And echo what was the comments made by council comments regarding the medical centre, because that is the key. The fact that they didn't consult is appalling. I think it's absolutely appalling, and it doesn't bode well for the future development as it progresses. This is if we're going to have any doubt at all that medical centre has been impeded by this construction, then I think we should think again on this matter. It's so important to the whole medical centre and the patients who use it and the staff, of course, as well. That it's a vital part of the community and should be addressed. And I'm very, very concerned about it, because the development as it is, I believe, is an overdevelopment anyway. Because it is trying to achieve too much in a small area, and I'm not happy with either the design or the effect of this construction will have on the site. As I said, for many reasons, particularly with the medical centre, and I've got great reservations about the future. So, for that reason, Mr. Chairman, I move refusal based on an overdevelopment and lack of consideration to local residents, particularly with respect to the medical centre. Thank you.
Do we have it, Mr. Smith, enough on that overdevelopment point?
I think members have got to be very careful around, because I think if I understood your argument, Councillor Wright, you were, whilst you're generally content with the form of development, you're concerned about the lack of communication, but also the impact of the construction and how that affects medical practice. I think members need to be very careful around, because there are conditions that do manage that process, and it is how, first of all, the construction logistics is brought forward, how the applicant, and I appreciate they haven't particularly started well in terms of levels of communication, but it's how they do communicate, how we require them to communicate, how we maybe work more closely with as officers when we're dealing with this construction logistics, and how we make sure they are properly engaged as part of that, and then again how we enforce that. It is an enforceable condition. It's something that I'm sure the medical practice will be very clear about what the construction logistics is saying, and they will be our eyes and ears, as will Love Norbury, and we will be there to make sure it is complied with. I think, for me, if that went to appeal, I'm pretty certain, if the principle is acceptable, that the inspector will be recommending a planning condition on construction logistics, which is what we are doing as part of this process. Chair.
Councillor Perry, and I'll bring myself in.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Similar to Councillor Wright, I think it would be a great shame to actually lose the two substantive buildings that are on site. They're clearly in a poor state of repair, but they're actually part of our local heritage, and I think it could be very pleasant buildings that could be converted into residential accommodation. The two small garages to the right-hand side could then be developed for the commercial use that we want to keep on site, and in my opinion that would be a much better scheme. I think the proposed buildings are totally out of character. They're off-the-shelf boxes that will do nothing to enhance the local area. The proposal is an overdevelopment. It's sort of stretching into every corner of available space on what is a very constrained site, and I think it will provide inadequate amenity for people moving into the area. There's clearly concerns around logistics, but logistics aren't necessarily what we can determine as a planning committee here tonight. But for me, I think the scheme is an overdevelopment. So I would second Councillor Wright's move to refuse, but if he's happy, I would like the fact that we move refusal as an overdevelopment on the size, massing and poor design, causing loss of amenity for adjoining occupiers, namely the health centre there, and also for incoming occupiers. I don't know if Councillor Wright's happy to have that, or I could move it
yes,
up.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, I'll bring myself in next. I think clearly, firstly, the first sort of key issue here is any potential impact on the operation of the doctor's surgery stroke medical centre. Now, I think it's clear from what we've seen that actually there's a significant chance that by accepting the proposal as put forward, the situation in terms of access actually improves, because you don't have that muddle of cars outside the garage that's there at the moment. With those moved away, you've actually got more space to actually access into the medical facility driveway. It strikes me that with that space there, where they've got double parking at the moment, there is adequate space for contractors to be able to build this out in accordance with a carefully controlled and developed construction logistics plan that shouldn't have any greater impact at all. In fact, probably have less impact than the current use, even during construction. It's clearly important that construction logistics plan is developed with and in close association with the health centre, but as long as that is done, then this can be built safely and securely, ensuring the short-term and long-term future of the medical centre. We have to bear in mind that in terms of the quality of the accommodation, 6 units have already been allowed under permitted development, with virtually no control over what those could be whatsoever. They could be tiny, and most of these typically are tiny, poor quality, shoddy conversions of those existing buildings. With no control over parking permits, all of those people would be entitled to have parking permits. So there would be more parking on the street, potentially, and we'd have a scruffy, probably poor quality development as a result. I think the scheme is well considered for what is a very tight site. I think the design could work well. It's a sort of modern interpretation of bay windows that are prevalent on the existing properties and residential properties in the street. And each of the units either has a small garden space or a reasonable sized balcony. So amenities of the residents are actually accommodated. Yes, it's close to the railway, but actually lots of residential accommodation in this immediate area is very close to the railway as well, and that won't benefit from modern forms of construction and modern building regulations that will ensure that acoustics, vibration, etc. are actually adequately dealt with. So I think all in all, it's a good scheme. It will help, again, common theme, provide additional homes in the borough, reasonable sized homes at that. I don't accept the argument that a 2-bed, 4-person form of residential is in any way substandard. No more than a 3-bed, 5-person accommodating a larger family or whatever. They're good-sized units and can be occupied very, very flexibly. So I think, as I say, I think it's a good scheme. The one thing I would say, though, the one concern I do have is the future use of the business unit, and I would suggest that we would take out the B2 use, because I think it just opens up too many difficulties. You wouldn't be able to have parking to it. You won't be able to have, if you do start to introduce, cars as part of a garage or whatever outside, you can reintroduce the problems that are there at the moment. So I think we should take that out and leave the B1B and B1C uses. So on that basis, I move the officer's recommendation for approval. Councillor Kabir.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it is a difficult site, I can understand, and but at the same time, what is present is there is not a very nice site, is it? I mean, it's a rundown building, 2 rundown buildings, and it looks really ugly. So option is to keep that, or do it under the parliamentary developments the way they want to do it. We have no say, or take this option. This option, I think, is much better because it's going to look clean and green and, nice presentation of the building as a new building. And I agree with you. I'm going to support the B1. Yeah, that's another advantage of being here and approving it in this meeting, if possible. And particularly employment side, I feel if we could have done without it, yeah, but then again, because of the legislation, maybe that is why it's there. And we just have to accept what is the present application is presenting, and taking care of the management of the building, the site with a good logistic, in consultation with the medical center. I think we will have a better deal than refusing it. So on that basis, I'm going to secondly move for approval.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else wishing to speak? No? Okay then. So we have 2 motions. Again, we have refusal, moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Perry on the grounds of overdevelopment as a relation to the scale, size and massing, the quality of the design and the amenities of future occupiers. Yeah. It's neighbours, I think you were talking about the impact on the...
What's the loss of the existing and for the income?
Right, so the amenities of future occupiers and existing occupiers. Okay then, so can I see those in favour of refusal?
That's 4, Chair.
And those against?
4, Chair.
In that case, that's a draw, and I use my casting vote to in favour of not supporting that motion, so that motion falls. Can I see those in favour of approval, the second motion?
4, Chair.
And those against?
4, Chair.
And so that is a draw once again, and again I use my casting vote in support of the motion, and so that application is approved. But very much with the emphasis on those conditions being a very clear and necessary requirement. Okay, thank you very much. Moves us on to the last item of this main agenda, our main committee meeting, which is item 6.2, 360 Brighton Road, and the presenting officer is Ross. Are you ready, please, Ross?
this for in terms of, because this is likely to be around 10 o'clock.
Yes, yes. I've just been prompted regarding the guillotine in terms of the subcommittee. It's possible that this last item on this agenda will go beyond 10 o'clock. Are we happy to accept the removal of the guillotine for the subcommittee, which only has one item on it? I think for the benefit of those people that have been in the public gallery awaiting that item, my recommendation would be that we do not accept the guillotine and we too take that item as well this evening. Is everybody happy with that? Yep. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Okay then, Ross, when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's just worth drawing to members' attention that there is actually a model up on the front desk there. So it may be best that if I give my presentation and then if you have a couple of minutes to look at that model, there's the existing scenario and the proposed scenario. You can take one out and put the other one in. And then if you save any questions for this forum so everybody can hear all the questions rather than asking questions separately up at the model, if that's okay. So this scheme for us this evening is for the demolition of the existing light industrial buildings at 360 Brighton Road and the provision of 4 two-bedroom houses, 1 two-bedroom bungalow, 2 two-bed and 2 one-bedroom flats, together with associated parking and landscaping. So this is the site in its context. So this is Brighton Road within South Croydon, and this is Churchill Road. Churchill Road is entirely residential, with the exception of this access into this light industrial unit. That's the purpose of the application this evening. In terms of Brighton Road, there's a bit of variety. The majority of these properties are entirely residential. Immediately either side of the access from Brighton Road, there's, I believe, accountants at ground floor of residential above, and then estate agents and a debt recovery office at ground floor with residential above. And as we go beyond, there's residential, and then beyond to the north, there's some retail uses at ground floor again with residential above. So this just shows you the site a bit more in terms of its context. So this is the access road here between the properties off Brighton Road, and then this is the extent of the existing buildings on the site there, with a slightly larger, it must be said, access road through to the rear onto Churchill Road. And just shows you the surrounding context and the really important relationship to the residents to the front and to the rear. And then just turning again, just to make that entirely clear, that's that access road to the rear, and our site is in this position, with the access road through to Brighton Road, and then the extent of those buildings can clearly be seen in terms of their nature and the relationship that they have to those properties. So this is just jumping down to Brighton Road then. So this is that access road through. That's the accountants and the other ground floor uses I mentioned, and you can see residential door to residential above. And then this within the site now looking back the other way towards Brighton Road. And then this is looking towards the upper, effectively looking north, if you like, along Brighton Road, and then looking south the other way. So these are the really important neighbours and the relationship to the application site. And then we've jumped over into the other access road. So this is the back of some of the properties on Churchill Road, and this is the existing industrial buildings effectively to the north. And then looking the other way again, you can see that relationship in terms of the existing arrangement on site as it sits today. So then that's looking back up towards Churchill Road, so you can see those, and it was the rears of those two properties were in the previous photograph, and then here we're just within Churchill Road looking back the other way, so you can just make out the industrial buildings in the background there. So this first slide I thought was really useful just to show you to compare the existing and the proposed, and this is very much what the model up there represents as well, which is really useful in terms of understanding the scheme because it is quite complicated. There is a very gradual land level change up towards Churchill Road. This is the existing arrangement, so sort of single storey elements, 2-storey and 2 sort of 3-storey if you can include that roof element. So the top is the existing arrangement. and then to the bottom you have the proposed arrangement, and I'll go into it in a bit more detail obviously, but effectively we've got 2-storey elements, a single-storey element, those are 3-storey dropping down to 2-storey, and then this, as you can see from a slightly different angle, that relationship. So delving into a little bit more detail for you. So this is the proposed bungalow with their amenity space within this courtyard area. 1, 2, 3, 4 2-bedroom houses. They would have amenity space in terms of ground floor area here and a first floor terrace. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then this is the 3-storey elements, which would be 1-bedroom flats at ground floor with a ground floor amenity space here, and then the 2 floors above are 2-bedroom duplexes, and their amenity space would be this upper terrace on both of those. You can see that you'll have noted from the photographs the access from Brighton Road is actually quite narrow, so the applicant is proposing that the access actually becomes now from Churchill Road to make provision for 7 car parking spaces, 8 if you include the disabled space, and then this area would be a turning head for a refuse and emergency vehicle to be able to enter and exit in a forward gear. Just really important actually just to reference separation distances for you. So we're looking at, in terms of from here to the rear of these properties, you're looking at approximately 24 metres. You're looking at approximately 23 metres in terms of these. And in terms of the properties on Churchill Road, it varies from between 10 to 12 metres in terms of that separation. In terms of the elevations then, so this is as would be seen from Brighton Road, if you could actually see it. Obviously the buildings are in the way and you wouldn't see all of that, but nevertheless it's obviously important to show you. The red line is the existing light industrial buildings, and you can see that the proposal does protrude above the heights of those, and then obviously where the building steps up, again this element protrudes above, and then this is a fairly large above what's existing in terms of the heights of the existing warehouse buildings. And then this is how it would be seen from Churchill Road, and you can see these are high level and obscurely glazed windows to prevent any overlooking. And then this is in effect a section through, so from Brighton Road you can see that very gradual rise up to Churchill. And then this is that bungalow, and then that's one of the 2-storey houses, and then again the bungalow, and then this is the 3-storey element, a flat with a duplex above. And then finally the other way. So, Chair, this application is actually recommended for refusal by officers. There are 3 grounds that we propose. The first is there is a current print works occupying this light industrial unit. So the first grounds for refusal is the loss of employment land. The second is in relation to inadequacy of the submission in terms of demonstrating that it safeguards flooding. We have objections from both the Environment Agency and the lead local flood authority. Third, in terms of the impact on the character of the area, while there are certain aspects of the design which we do support, as an overall piece we feel that it is a cramped form of development and goes a bit too far. Fourthly, we feel that there's impacts in terms of the accommodation for future occupiers, particularly in terms of their outlook and particularly in terms of the ground floor flats within these 3-storey elements. And finally, visual intrusion to the surrounding residential occupiers. I'll leave you with this slide, which shows you this is obviously from the Brighton Road side, looking at the front of the properties, and then this is as you walk through with the car parking that would be in this position. Chair, the recommendation is to refuse planning permission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think if we have a quick look at the model first, and then we'll come back to questions. Yep. Okay, questions for clarification. I'm going to start off with one. The existing use, and I have to say, as somebody who actually referred this using Chair's powers, was somewhat surprised to hear that the building was actually still fully occupied. Is that actually, can we just confirm that is actually the case, that it is fully in use at the moment, and that no other alternative sort of uses have been slipped through in terms of permitted developments or anything like that? And also, how does that then work, or not, as the case may be, in terms of the marketing side of things? Obviously, normally we would expect a vacant facility such as this to be marketed unsuccessfully for 18 months before we would consider it being acceptable to release the commercial use.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so yes, it is occupied. The case officer, as part of this scheme, went on site. It's the print works that occupy the building in its entirety, although, to be fair, a fair portion of that is for storage, but it is occupied. Notwithstanding that, the applicant did submit a 18-month marketing strategy to show that they had marketed it to the relevant parties. We dispute the findings of that, so we don't agree that the land should be released for residential.
And why is that disputed, that the marketing material is for any particular reasons?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it needs to show that, first of all, the premises needs to be vacant, of which it clearly isn't. There's somebody in there. And secondly, in terms of the marketing itself, it needs to be done to an appropriate standard in terms of the amount that's being charged, that it's being marketed for. And you'll see in the papers that our view is that it was marketed at too high a value, which would potentially put off potential occupiers. And then, secondly, let me just refer to the papers, bear with me. It. We didn't have full details of all of the respondents, so the marketing paper suggested that there was quite a high rate of response, but we didn't have details of who that was and what their interests were. So we felt that we needed more information in terms of that marketing to satisfy us that we could release it. And in the context of a strong protecting policy, and in the context of the London plan, which is very strict in terms of what employment land can be released, and we are a restricted borough within the London plan, we didn't feel that it's one that we were satisfied could be released at this stage.
And the current use class?
I think I know where you're going with this. It's B1. Permitted development is in place for B1 to residential, but for that to be the case, it has to be under 500 square metres. And I did a quick assessment of the floor area of this building, and I would suggest that it's over 500 square metres, and therefore permitted development, or rather prior approval, could not be applied for in this scenario.
Okay, thank you very much. Other questions? Councillor Perry.
Just following on from your questions around the marketing, because in 8.5 it shows that the marketing halfway through or during the process of marketing, they put the price up 50%. I mean, that's a fairly unusual decision to take during a marketing process if you're not selling a property, to put it up 50%, which I guess led officers to feel that it wasn't entirely above board.
Okay, if there are no further questions. We have, I think, potentially 3 people wishing to address us. We have Ms Lloyd and Ms Fisher, but I've got the note saying Ms Fisher may not speak. So is it just Ms Lloyd? Is it just you speaking as objector? Yeah. And then we have Mr Munro and potentially Ms Osler. Ms Osler? It's just you. Okay, fine. And then we have Councillor Gatland. So, Ms Lloyd first, you have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your concerns about the application.
Thank you. Well, the strength of the feeling in the community against this application is supported by the fact that 71 of the 73 responses received were objections. Indeed, a large number of residents sit in the public gallery this evening in order to show just how strong that feeling is. I'd like to start by saying there was no consultation whatsoever with the residents about this project. It's our submission that the development as currently proposed would be fundamentally detrimental to the local community. Whilst the scheme is in breach of numerous provisions of the relevant planning rules and regulations, in the short time allowed, I'll focus on 4. First, traffic, parking and safety. Traffic and parking on Churchill Road is already far beyond its maximum capacity. Residents have to wait long periods for spaces and park their cars on other roads in the area. There is indeed a petition with the council at the moment in respect of parking on the road to make it a controlled parking area, and furthermore a petition to make it a one-way street because the traffic is already so bad. The plans which allow for just 9 spaces for 13 properties will inevitably increase that stress. In respect of safety, you have seen the only proposed vehicle access to the site between 65 and 67 Churchill Road. The passageway is in fact incredibly small, and given the cars that are parked either side on Churchill Road, there will not be enough space for a fire engine or any fire appliance to get into the site, creating a huge health and safety risk. My second point is in respect to intrusion of existing properties. The current factory buildings are single-storey and some 2-storey. The 3-storey is just building space. The proposed buildings will tower over the 2-storey buildings on Churchill Road. And furthermore, they have terraces and windows which will give a view out onto the gardens and directly into the kitchen, bathroom and bedroom windows of the properties on Churchill Road. In fact, the bungalow of the development is directly behind 360A with no space whatsoever. This would be a huge invasion of privacy for existing properties, but also not particularly pleasant for those that will move into the planned development. The aspect of overlooking has plainly been considered by the applicant. He owns 358 Brighton Road, which in fact is the property on the right-hand side of the entrance from Brighton Road, where there's just a car park behind and no buildings whatsoever. My third point is in respect of the poor design and the fact that the buildings are out of character with the area. Whilst a development such as this invites innovative design, with respect, the buildings planned are not only ugly, but also incredibly cramped. The design is entirely out of keeping with the Victorian brick terraces on Churchill Road. My final point, which has already been raised, is in respect of marketing the property. It's been marketed with Daniel Adams, which is a residential...
Ms Lloyd, I'm afraid your time is up, but I think we've got the gist of what you're saying on that last point.
I'm grateful.
Already.
May I just say in summary...
I'm sorry, we were already over time. I'll let you go on a little bit already.
All right.
I'm sorry about that. We have to be quite strict on this, I'm afraid. And so now, Mr Munro. Mr Munro, you've got up to 3 minutes. And Ms Lloyd, if you wouldn't mind just turning your microphone off. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for calling this application in for review and for allowing me to speak this evening on behalf of our applicants, Mr and Mrs Young. Our clients approached us nearly 3 years ago to look at turning their site into something more relevant and valuable for the community, providing much-needed housing and to create a legacy of exemplar dwellings. I would ask the committee to focus on the positive attributes this scheme will bring to the borough. In terms of the key issue of change of use and loss of employment, the printing business has been there for 40 years, but it is not a thriving local business. It is in the process of being wound down following the loss of key contracts and staff retiring. There are currently only 4 full-time employees approaching retirement age. The business has been kept ticking over to keep the building in occupation to deter squatters or vandalism. Marketing for nearly 2 years has shown there is no demand for B1 or D1 use. The only interest has been from commercial developers seeking to develop the site into housing. We believe we meet Croydon's policy EM5 on development of former industrial sites. The current business use has significant impact on the residential amenity of this area, and we believe it is therefore a net benefit to the local residents to remove this B1 use, providing actually a reduction in traffic on the site. In terms of the design and massing of the scheme, We have developed a modern vernacular rooted in both the history of the site and the local context, with pitch roofs, a mixture of window sizes and use of appropriate materials, including brick and metal cladding, embedding the development into its setting and harking back to its industrial past. We believe the scale and massing of the scheme is wholly appropriate for the site, given the bulk of the existing structures, as well as the surrounding 2 to 3 storey houses. There are other benefits, including opening up a new route connecting Churchill Road and Brighton Road, a benefit for local residents. We also believe, in terms of quantum, our proposals for 9 units sit within the suggested density for the site. The houses meet and, in some cases, exceed London Plan space standards. We've designed them to have active frontages with good surveillance for security. They are upside-down courtyard houses, providing optimal living space and visual amenity for the occupiers without impact to adjacent properties' amenity. You've seen additional 3D views on this, I hope. Additional points of detail relating to landscaping, mitigation of flood risk, contamination, we would expect to be conditioned. I would like also to make the point that all issues of access, parking, fire have been addressed in our report and supported by the Council. In summary, we believe this is a great opportunity to create some much-needed family homes and be a positive contribution to the local area. We would argue that the replacement of these unneighbourly industrial sheds with a more attractive development and a resident use is to the benefit of the community. We would urge the Council to support our clients' aspirations for the site. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Councillor Gatland, you have up to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here this evening to object to this planning application and to support the officer recommendation for refusal, and indeed to support the objections of the local residents in both Churchill and Brighton Roads. This is a backland industrial site with a very, very constrained site. The design and layout offers a cramped development and is dominated by these 2 3-storey buildings. It does provide housing, and a bungalow is welcome, but not in the position it is. There's no 3-bedroom accommodation, family accommodation, and it's not affordable. If approved, it will impact on the amenities of residents adjacent in Brighton Road and in Churchill Road. The numbers, particularly from 55 to 65, will really look out on a really ugly, dominant building. And, of course, it will impact upon their amenities and cause problems of noise and privacy. And the traffic implications are much wider here, as we've heard from the resident here. We know a development like this will generate a lot of vehicle movements within the site. And entering through these really narrow entrances will impact on both the roads. But I think particularly on Churchill Road, that already has serious traffic and parking problems, and we've heard about the safety issue that the resident has raised. It's beside flood zones, and as we have heard, there is an objection in from the Environment Agency and the local lead flooding authority. There's simply not enough information here, because we all remember the serious flooding issues along here not so long ago. And the marketing issue has been brought up, and I know residents have brought that to me, as well as hearing from it in the report. I mean, we need sites like this in an area of intensification of development like Brighton Road. We need local jobs for local people, and this is employment land. To summarise, this is a very cramped overdevelopment of the site. It presents potential risks on safety and flooding. It impacts on traffic and parking. It doesn't fit easily into the area due to the design. And the impact on the amenity of residents, I think, is simply too much, and there is a potential loss of employment. So I would urge the committee to look very carefully at this and to refuse this application. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Do officers have anything further they wish to add?
Thank you, Chair. I think I've been clear on the recommendation to refuse and why we're doing that. I just thought it was worth just getting into a bit of the detail of the parking that's obviously been raised eloquently by the objectors. In essence, we don't suggest a refusal reason in terms of parking. There's 8 on-street parking spaces proposed for 9 units. We feel that that's acceptable in an area with a PTAL of 4. And in terms of the arrangement, the existing site, as you'll see in 8.24 of the report, there's actually a reduction in terms of peak hour trips for a residential scheme compared to the light industrial scheme. And also, you'll note that they would no longer be utilising the access onto Brighton Road. It would purely be onto Churchill Road. So in that aspect, we as officers do not raise any objection, and therefore a recommendation for refusal on that basis is not suggested. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'll bring in Councillor Perry, then I'll bring in myself, and then Councillor Wright.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chairman. I know this site very well. It's in my ward of Crowham, and I think we've heard all the reasons why this scheme should not be allowed tonight. It's a terrible scheme. It's got no regard for the locality. As we've heard from the local objector, this area is very Victorian in character, semi-detached Victorian houses to Brighton Road. This side of Churchill Road, terraced houses, again Victorian, and that is the character of the area. We've got existing employment uses on the site, and we do need jobs for our growing population. We know we have a housing need, but those people also need jobs, and this is a site that can provide, and currently does provide, jobs. Far too much being squeezed onto the site that will have a huge detrimental impact on the adjoining occupiers. And as it sits between Brighton and Churchill Roads, it will dominate both roads. And whilst there are large buildings there sort of dotted through the back of the site at the moment, it's the use of the buildings that will be very different for the adjoining occupiers. At the moment, it's, as we've heard, it's commercial use, sort of Monday to Friday, 8 till 5. So therefore, there's not an out of hours overlooking, etc., that could happen. This, on the other hand, is a 24/7, people living, people overlooking, people being at the bottom of your garden. And it's not, I don't think it will be a pleasant environment to be with. Churchill Road already struggles with highways issues, as we've heard. Parking is beyond saturation point, and there are issues around speeding, and as we've heard from the resident, also a desire from some residents for one-way working to try and help with some of the situations in the road. We've heard about the flood issues, and we often on this committee touch on flood risks, and on this occasion the Environment Agency do actually have an issue with flooding here, so I think we need to take that very seriously. The height and massing will be out of keeping with the surrounding area, and whilst the scheme is inward looking, the buildings will still be very dominant. And to quote Councillor Shafi Khan on the previous scheme, you know, will you be able to swing a cat in these developments? Will the amenity be any good for the incoming occupiers? I don't think it will be. So the scheme is a very poor scheme. I think it's a very bleak scheme. It does nothing for the local environment. It doesn't enhance the local character of the area. And I wholly support the officers' recommendations to refuse this scheme. Thank you. And I move that refusal.
Okay, thank you. So I'll bring myself in next, and then I'll bring in Councillor Wright. I think we have the situation here where, as I said earlier on, I wasn't aware when I first thought this ought to come to the committee that the buildings were in existing use, and I think that's obviously an incredibly important aspect. I mean, we've heard it put to us that that use is minimal and is running down, but the fact of the matter is that it is still in use. That would be a very different situation if it was closed, that the marketing had been completed as required, or indeed was sort of well underway, or there was some kind of sort of clear indication that it was unlikely to be reoccupied. I think that the fact that it is occupied, though, does clearly move us to refuse this application. It is unfortunate, though, that if it is the case that the industrial uses, or the printing use is running down, that we will then potentially see the site sit empty for many months and years. And that would obviously have a very negative impact on the local area. Let's hope that does not happen. But I think we have to sort of go with the current situation as it is. It will be interesting to see if, when the owners tot up the floor area, if it still comes to under 500 square metres, because otherwise there is the risk, obviously, of this essentially going down a permitted development route, and that would very much, like the previous application, tie our hands. I think, though, the scheme does have quite a lot to commend it, though, setting aside that, that current and ongoing employment use. I think the design, many aspects of the design is innovative. It actually, you know, when you look at the existing situation, let's face it, there are a bloody awful set of buildings there that do nothing for the character of the area whatsoever. They aren't, you know, twee little Victorian cottages or anything like that. They are hard-nosed commercial buildings rammed in between the gardens of residential property. So it isn't some kind of idyllic sort of setting, a lovely little mews or anything like that. So I think taking that scheme, if it wasn't for the employment use, and actually coming up with an innovative scheme for providing residential in there would work. And I think many aspects of the design, as proposed, are very good. But I think the massing is too great. I think particularly the three-storey elements are too high, and certainly the second one along is definitely too great. And I think the impact created on the downstairs one-bedroom units does create a very cramped and enclosed unit that isn't really acceptable in terms of the amenities of future occupiers. I think the bungalow seems a rather unfortunate sort of addition to the scheme. Doesn't fit in particularly well and prevents the ability to be able to have some open space within any development here. I think a one-for-one car parking scheme isn't absolutely essential, but if it can be delivered sensibly, that would make sense. And again, you know, we've heard about the very narrow accesses, but those accesses are in use all the time at the moment for vehicles. So some kind of future scheme which continues to have those as access points, or one of them as access point, would actually make sense. But I think that everything is just too tightly crammed in at the moment. There's a number of units too many, and I say particularly the height of the taller building that falls out of the envelope of the existing buildings is particularly unfortunate. So I think, all in all, I think I say some really interesting points about the design, but it's not gone far enough, and it cannot overcome that employment policy issue. So I think on that basis, we have no choice but to refuse this. Hope that a positive outcome happens in the future in terms of those buildings that are there at the moment, or whatever potentially replaces them. So I'm, on that basis, going to second the motion for refusal. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to go over the points that have already been raised, but I've got real concerns with this development. I mean, apart from the loss of employment, which I think is the main issue and is very prominent, the actual development itself is very badly thought out, very badly constructed, and does not fit into the site whatsoever. And no consideration seems to be made for the fact that it is in a very serious flood area. And as the Flood Authority has said, that you know, we've got no reason to accept that there any consideration made to runoffs or the genuine drainage problems. The effect it will have upon the residents already in Churchill Road and Brighton Road is intense, and I think that this is something which should be addressed if any application did come through in years to come. That those considerations should be borne in mind, and also the access is obviously inadequate for that particular development, both in its excessive in its entrance to Churchill Road from Churchill Road, and also the size of the access. So there's a lot of things wrong with it, Mr. Chairman, and I would support refusal.
Okay. Does anybody else? Councillor Kabir?
Yeah, I'm going to also support the refusal on the basis of that the design and colour scheme is look very damping. You know, it doesn't doesn't make you happy. Just put it like this. Some people have mentioned ugly a couple of times. Anyway, so yeah, it's not getting my support. Thank you.
I think the intention was for it to reflect the industrial heritage, and maybe it does do that a little bit too much. That certainly seems to be the feeling. Okay. Anybody else wishing to comment? No. In that case, we have the one motion before us for refusal on the grounds set out in the officer's report. Moved by Councillor Perry, seconded by myself. Can I see those in favour?
That's unanimous, Chair.
Okay, then. Thank you. Okay. So that brings this meeting to a close. Those of us who are able to get away, please enjoy the rest of your evening. We do have one item on the subcommittee agenda, and for the good of those that are staying for that, if those people who aren't staying could depart quite quickly, that would be most appreciated.